a playlist original.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 92 Back to the Blockbuster with your hosts, Gaius and Jackson. Another anniversary episode. I feel like these are like old hat
That's
for you,
right.
Joe. You've done so many.
That's right. Yes, and I love them. Yeah, they're some of my favorite things that we cover on here. And today we got a juicy one from 2003. We're looking at X2 today.
Yeah.
And I know that you're a big fan of the X-Men movies, and this movie in particular, as I'm sure you're about to make your case.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the X-Men, and particularly this X2. I know, and some people have seen it called X2. It was also marketed as X2 X-Men United as well when it came out. Came out on May 2nd, 2003, so it will be 20 years since this movie was released. This is like in the early kind of stages of comic book movies being like a bit of a rebirth. Particularly, I think Marvel kind of setting its own course for comic book movies that arguably started with Blade and then continued with X-Men in 2000, and then Spider-Man in 2002, and then, of course, the movie we're going to talk about today in 2003. For those of you who don't know, it was directed by Bryan Singer, who we'll talk a little bit about a little later. He's a little problematic now, and apparently he was a bit problematic even filming some of these. There's some interesting behind the scenes tidbits about the making of that first movie and this one. They've talked about when I think the first movie had an anniversary, and they kind of rehashed some of the making of the first two in particular. And Halle Berry was very vocal for her, gave us some juicy stuff to talk about. She's very vocal at the time too, when things weren't going completely right on set of X-Men and X2. And there was a comment that she made at one point where I think when the comment first came out years ago, the traits from them make her seem like she was coming off as like a little bitchy and complaining about Bryan Singer. But knowing what we know now about Bryan Singer, her comments make a lot of sense, and she kind of got a bit validated
Nice
in the years since. But yeah, directed by Bryan Singer, this movie has a very stacked ensemble cast that includes Patrick Stewart, Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen, Halle Berry, Famke Janssen, James Marsden, Rebecca Romijn, who was Rebecca Romijn Stamos at the time because she was married to John Stamos, Brian Cox, Alan Cumming, Bruce Davison, Shawn Ashmore, Aaron Stanford, Kelly Hu, and Anna Paquin. That is a lot of people just on there.
That is a pretty thoroughly stacked cast, as you just said. Yeah, I know. I was delighted.
Yeah. Full of talent too. A lot of talented people in this movie. Its plot is inspired by the graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, and it concerns the genocidal Colonel William Stryker leading an assault on Professor Xavier's school to build his own version of Xavier's mutant tracking computer Cerebro in order to destroy every mutant on Earth and to save the human race from them, forcing the X-Men to team up with the Brotherhood of Mutants, led by Magneto, their former enemies, to stop Stryker and save the mutant race. Like I said, it was released on May 2nd, 2003, and it received positive reviews for its storyline, action sequences, and performances, and the film grossed $407 million worldwide on a reported budget that is set to anywhere between $110 million to $125 million. I guess to start, just like your quick Cliff Notes, what did you think? Because had you seen it before, or you hadn't seen it before?
No, that was the first time watch for myself. So I know we hadn't ever really discussed this on screen together, but briefly a little bit off camera. So
Yeah.
I very much miss. I mean, so keep in mind, I definitely wouldn't have seen these when this movie came out. I was probably just turning 5. So yeah, May, I was a month from turning 5. So I didn't really catch any of the X-Men movies when they were first coming out. I would have probably been like a little, a few years later when I would have gotten around to seeing the first and maybe the third. Definitely did not see X2. I had not seen any. None of the scenes stood out to or were familiar to me upon rewatch. My first watch, I suppose. So this one I did not see before. So yeah, the point is I was very behind on the X-Men movies. I don't think I've seen any of the ones from the 2010s either. Just like one of those like superhero like movie universes that I never got around to watching. So this was almost like a fresh, brand new experience for me. And it was quite, I guess, charming to be back in this kind of era of Marvel movies where just before what was to come, like just a few years before the MCU and everything that followed after that, it was kind of like simpler times. And honestly, it was refreshing to be back in this era of Marvel superhero movies. It was nice to be back, definitely.
Like no universe building, like it was just like its own like thing, which is kind of refreshing to kind of look back on, where we weren't. I mean, not that I mind, what the MCU started, because it did. What we got, that end result with Endgame was worthy of, like, building up to that, right?
Definitely.
But
Yep.
it is interesting to go back and watch something that isn't burdened by the fact that there are things in this movie that they are trying to set up for, like, sequel. Of course, like, there's a lot of open-ended things that happen in X2. Isn't about greater universe building. It's just more about, like, expanding this
A
story
one
rather
movie at a
than
time approach. Yeah.
rather than
And
linking
I
it to other
love
things. Yeah.
At this time, there only would have been one other mainstream Marvel sequel out at the time. That would have been Blade 2, like, because Spider-Man 2 hadn't come out at this time. This was the first
Yep.
X-Men sequel. They went on to do Fantastic Four, I think, the next year or two after. So this was
Yeah, I
like
think
the
05,
first. Yeah, 05. There you go.
Yeah.
So this would have been like the second Marvel sequel. There would have been no other huge storylines being followed at this time. And it's just weird
Right.
to go back and think about that now after having seen it. But yeah, I'd say like the movie was definitely like benefited because it was not trying to incorporate so many. I mean, granted, there are a lot of X-Men to follow. There's a lot of characters to jam in the runtime, but it's far and wide different than what later would become trying to shove a bunch of different storylines and characters into a wider universe.
Yeah.
And so it almost felt like more comprehensive. And it was like, although there were a lot of different characters, I feel like now, especially for me looking back who hadn't experienced this before, it was a little bit more like I was more like conditioned, I guess, to work with a lot of different characters and remember where they had left off and who was what and all that sort of thing. So it definitely wasn't as much of a tall order as I can imagine this movie seeing for the first time in 2003 being like, who's this person again? And what did they do last movie? And there's so many different characters on screen. I don't know. Is that something that you found that you had to juggle at all, or?
So I remember, I guess, to put it into more context, you feel it too when you see the first movie, the one that came out in 2000. There are a lot of people in it. This one even more so. They've added new characters and all that. And the hard part, I think, I told you, like, I bet I told you while we were filming the other episode, but I used to collect, like, X-Men comic books. Like, I grew up on X-Men, so, like, having, like, a live action X-Men movie at the time was such a treat. I mean, granted they didn't look how they really looked at the comic books. They changed, like, like black leather suits, which actually made sense to me. Like, the kind of outfits they had in the comic books maybe wouldn't translate that well on screen. But however,
in particular,
they did kind of adapt those kind of costumes when they did, like, First Class and stuff. So, like, it can work. I just think at the time in 2000, you probably wouldn't have wanted to see, like, they make a joke about it in the first movie about wearing yellow spandex because Wolverine complains about, like, his costume, like, being tight or whatever. And so there was all those little changes. And of course, like, you have a movie that's dealing with a team, so it's hard to fit everyone into getting the amount of screen time that they probably should to, like, really establish their characters the way you should. Especially, I mean, I think the first X movie is like hour and 44 minutes or something like that. It's not long. But it was cool just seeing those characters that you've read and to see characters that you've seen on, like, the cartoon. Like, the animated show was huge when I was a kid. So seeing them in live action form was cool. And
no doubt.
And they handled, you can tell that Bryan Singer, because he was coming off Usual Suspects and At People. I think that was the two main movies he had done before X-Men. And you can tell that this is someone that has talent, but, like, necessarily he hasn't done a huge movie of this scale before. Like, you can kind of see that in some of the sequences, because there are some pretty solid action set pieces in the first movie, but when you compare to what he does in the second one, because there's a bunch of action set pieces in the second one, you can tell that this is someone, when they made that first movie, that was getting their feet wet and like kind of learning what to do. And you can even tell that with the cast too. I mean, there's a lot of interesting changes from, like, the first movie to the second movie. Like, in the case of, like, Halle Berry Storm, she has an accent in the first movie because
so I heard about that. Yeah,
her character is from South Africa, so she does have an accent. They drop it completely in the second one. And they're probably just like, "Yo, you've been in America a long time now." It didn't sound great when you had it in the first movie, and I don't think anyone's going to care if you drop it. So
sounds like it was better off, or even if it's a continuity error.
Yeah, we've seen similar things with, like, Elizabeth Olsen and playing Scarlet Witch, who had an accent in, like, Age of Ultron, and then they eventually dropped it because it just, I think, just sounds
interesting. I did not realize that. I've actually never heard anybody address her accent. I don't know how, but I've still never gotten around to seeing Age of Ultron, so I did not know that. And nobody has ever told, like, I've never heard anybody talk about that.
She had a full on, like, her first scene, like, it's like, I think her character's from, like, oh, is it from Russia? I got to look it up again, but, like, it's supposed to be, like, she's supposed to have, like, she has, like, a thick accent, and, like, Age of Ultron, and it
Interesting.
completely dropped in her subsequent appearances in the
Okay.
MCU.
Yeah, probably better off because she
But yeah,
is an American, as far as I
yeah,
know.
yeah. And so then they did the same thing with like Halle Berry Storm, and like I said, there's bigger action set pieces in the sequel that you can just tell like this is someone that's coming at you have a hit now. You made that first movie, it made some money, and now you have the confidence of like, all right, we did this once, like let's try to go bigger and see what we can do. And you can actually tell that. I mean, it's been a while, but I remember the first time I watched X1 and X2 back to back, even though I think there is a lot of charm in that first X-Men movie, and like of course it's the first time you're seeing your favorite characters in live action form.
Mhm.
it The quality, not saying that like the script is good, all that stuff, but it's X2 is so much bigger in its scope compared to X-Men that it is
Right.
strange watching them back to back where it's like, oh wow, like this is a much better like execution than they did with that
It,
first movie. But yeah,
I could be, correct me if I'm wrong if this isn't a good comparison, because as I told you off camera, I did technically I've seen X1, but this was a few years ago. I don't think I was like, exhibiting the best movie watching tendencies when I watched it. I didn't retain a lot of it. I think I
yeah,
might have been like, my mind might have been somewhere else. I don't recall a lot of X1. However, so I feel like the X2 kind of was like a Dark Knight sort of situation where it was like, yeah, the first one was good, but
yeah,
the second one just is so much bigger, bolder, wider in scope, and definitely hailed as a lot more successful, right?
yeah. That's a pretty good comparison. I know like some people are going to be like, oh, don't compare this to the Dark Knight. He's not saying that like
No, not
it's on the
quality
level.
wise.
It's on the level of the Dark Knight. I told Jackson I want to make an argument this episode that I do think it is one of the best superhero movies out there though, and doesn't get enough credit for being as good as it is. But I think that more has to do with we just have so many good superhero movies
Right.
since X2 that it's easy to forget about it. But I think
That's a
that
great point.
at the time when it came out, it felt like fans were like, oh, this is like a vast improvement over what they attempted with that first movie. And that's not even to say that the first movie is bad. It's just it's
No, but it
you
can
can
be
just
improved
tell
upon.
it can be improved upon. And like one of the things that is strong about that first movie is a lot of the stuff between Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, which they kind of carry over into the sequel a bit, even though they don't have like a ton of screen time together. There's still that the duality of like their intentions when it comes to like the human race, right? That's still at play
Yes.
throughout the whole thing. Professor Xavier, wants to believe in a peaceful coexistence between mutants and humans, and because of Magneto's background, and what he's seen as a kid, what he's gone through, does not believe in that peaceful
Mm,
coexistence, as we see very later on in the movie where when he needs to switch Cerebro to like not harm mutants anymore, and he very much it's not hard to make him like switch it to like, want to kill all the humans off. So like that kind of stuff is always that was interesting. They really played on that in the first movie, and I know that some fans don't love this. The character of Rogue, making her a teenager in the first movie, I know it's not the Rogue that we're used to, especially if you read the comic books or watch the animated series.
okay.
She's like a not older, like 20s, maybe mid 20s, Southern Belle. Like she can fly because she stole some of her powers from another mutant, so she's able to fly and she's strong.
Okay.
What they did with Rogue in that first movie, making her a teenager, I think it was a good choice, because I think if you have ability where you can't physically touch someone, I think someone who is a teenager, that's a more interesting lens to see that power through, I think. And they really did a good job of like
I agree.
creating that.
Thinking about back to your point, like I totally agree with it now. I remember being kind of curious. I didn't really have a thorough understanding of what her powers really were in the movie, because
Okay.
to keep in mind, I hadn't really seen one, or at least I don't
Right.
consider myself having seen it. I just don't recall it. So
Right.
yeah, maybe you can break that down for me. What exactly?
So, and there's examples of it in the second one. So what she
Yeah.
can't like physically touch anyone without draining their life force. So in the case of like
Okay.
so in the case of mutants, she can, if she touches them for a short period of time, she can actually take some of their powers. So like that scene where Pyro like fires off all the fireballs at the cops, and then
Yes.
she gets him to stop by like she grabs his ankle, and then she puts
Right.
all the flames out because she took power. And
Um,
then they have that like brief moment when her and Bobby kiss, and then she blows out the cold, like, yeah. But if she
right.
does it for too long, she can kill you.
I
So that's
see.
why the whole relationship between her and Bobby, why when
Is the way it is.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then when Logan gets introduced to him, and he's like, "Oh, this is your boyfriend. So how do you guys?" And
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, we're still trying to figure that out." Like, yeah, yeah,
I kind of got the sense that something was, unconventional between the
right.
two of them by the way that Logan poses the question, but I didn't exactly like clue in, not knowing the nature of her powers. I was like, what is he getting at? Am I going to see a little bit more of that? This is obviously, there will be probably some complaints about the movie that I have, but things that don't necessarily resonate with me or that I didn't quite
Right.
get because I didn't watch the first one before X2 and I wanted to and all, just I didn't have the time by the time
Yeah,
I was
I
watching
think
this to the episode's sake, but
I think they
Netflix
do
should
a
have.
decent job of like kind of allowing you to like putting in kind of crumbs, like you're like, okay, in case you didn't see the first one, like
Yeah. Oh,
here's hints of what these relationships are like and
certainly.
how they're connected.
I
So
agree.
in the first, and I know it seems like we're explaining the first movie, but it's in the context
Hmm.
of like getting you into like the second one. And
Right.
she's more of like she has a large role in that because she gets connected with Logan in a real way, and they actually kind of bond like in a kind of like a I would say like maybe uncle, he's kind of like way or like brother sister kind of way where
Okay.
she's afraid of like what her powers can do, and he is what thinks that when they get introduced to Xavier and like all the other X-Men and stuff, he it's like, I know there are a lot of people that we can't trust, but I think we can maybe trust, them. And their relationship is actually the heart of that first movie, which is why she's so excited to see him when he shows up in the second one. Uh,
Right.
and so like the first movie, because it is a lot of people in it, and some people do get shortchanged. I mean, it's Hugh Jackman's movie, it's Wolverine's movie.
Mhm.
He's the lead, and I mentioned this to you before. I think that's because most casual moviegoers, even if they're not familiar with X-Men, they know who Wolverine is, and
Yeah.
I think that's why he took a front seat. The other X-Men in the first movie, and you can probably see this to some of the other characters in X2, are more like part of like the supporting ensemble. They don't really like, even though they have
Yeah.
scenes where they get to showcase their powers and there's some cool action stuff with them, you don't really
Definitely.
get a lot. You don't get a ton of development from some of the other characters. The ones that get developed the most are Magneto, Xavier, uh, Rogue, and Wolverine. And
Wolverine.
then there's
Okay.
a whole, and then they do set up the whole kind of like flirtatious thing between Logan and Jean Grey, and then
Yeah.
Logan and Scott kind of being like at odds because Scott can
Mm.
tell that like, yeah, he's into his girl, and also he doesn't quite trust him because he is the leader of the X-Men, so he has to protect them on that front. But Wolverine is kind of introduced as a wild card, so like they kind of build up that kind of tension a bit that does
Okay.
carry over into the second movie. um but yeah, the second movie, it is more of like the way we're introduced to Logan again is he doesn't really remember anything about his past. That's kind of set up in the first movie too, like he is a bit of a blank slate, so he doesn't really remember how he got the adamantium, like all that other stuff that he's trying to remember. um,
Okay.
he really wants Charles to tell him what all that stuff is. And of course, there's a lot of they do in the second one where it's like, sometimes the mind has to discover things for itself. And like,
Right.
he basically can't give him all of the answers that he wants. But even though he is a blank slate, the cool thing about the growth from him between the first movie and the second movie is right away you feel there a little bit of a camaraderie when he comes back. Rogue's excited to see him, like
Yeah.
Storm is excited to see him. Jean Grey, in her own different way, seems excited to see him. The only one who's not too excited is Cyclops.
Scott.
Scott.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, um,
Understandably so.
but I thought that, yeah. What were you gonna say?
So if I understand correctly, at the end of the first X-Men, Logan sort of kind of goes off afterwards on like sort of like a is he trying to discover
So
his
he's
past,
trying,
like kind of like a
yeah. So
spiritual
he's trying to
quest or something?
find. So where he ends up, where we first Alkali Lake. That's where
Yep.
he's sent. That's where Xavier says you can go to find some of the answers that you're looking for. So he
Okay.
he actually steals Cyclops' motorcycle to take said trip to
Ah,
Alkali Lake. But yeah, he's with the X-Men team. They all stop Magneto together. Magneto was using Rogue's power. Like he was gonna like have it transferred to her. So like some, in a lot of the comic movies, it's kind of like I want to destroy the human race kind of machine, and that's what
right.
he was using Rogue for. And that's why actually Rogue has in the movies at least strip of white hair because when she took Magneto's life force, that's what she like inherited from him. Which is why they make the comment.
Oh,
Why the comment
cool.
on the X jet when Magneto and Mystique are laughing, and they're like, "What are you laughing at?" And he says like, "Oh, I love what you've done with your hair." And then she goes to take off her glove to go touch him again, and like they hold her back. So that is like a callback to that stuff in the
Okay,
at the end of the
cool. Because
first
I would
movie.
not have picked up on that.
But yeah,
Neat.
so he is trying to figure out like who he is and where he came from because
Right.
he really is a blank slate. Even leading into this movie.
yeah, not to stay on X1, but I'm just
No,
curious
that's
as to
fine.
how far back do his memories go? Where in Logan's mind is he starting
So
from?
he remembers some of the program and stuff like that, but he doesn't remember like how he got the claws or the adamantium and all that. Because as a mutant, the only mutant power that
Okay,
he has is he can heal fast. So that's what makes him a mutant. The claws were something that were given
right.
to him that we learned that Colonel Stryker was a part of the whole like. And the comic books is called like
Okay,
the Weapon X program. They were like testing like on different people to
right.
see if they're, especially someone like him who can heal fast, if he could survive the implantation of the adamantium, or if he could survive it like coming out of his body, in a real,
Right.
significant way. Which is why it also works on Deathstrike, the girl that has like the long
Mm.
nails in the sequel, because she also has the
Yes,
same
they have
powers as her.
an
Yeah.
encounter later in the
And the
movie.
encounter, yeah, a little thankless. I think she's only in 3 scenes. And I think
Yeah,
she only has,
something like
I
that. Yeah.
think she has one line, and it's not even like supposed. Yeah, just one line that she doesn't really get to do much, but she is a badass towards the end.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, that's where we kind of like gotten with Wolverine and Logan, and I love how things start though. I love so the opening scene. So when this movie came out, this was the last year that I worked the summer at the movie theater I worked at.
Oh,
So
cool.
it was Pacific Theaters, which didn't turn into ArcLight, and ArcLight is now closed. It's not because of the COVID, but I worked there for 3 years. So I actually did see the first X-Men movie there while I worked there. That was my first year working there. And then
Nice.
I also saw X2. And like my excitement for this one was so much bigger because I could even tell from the trailers that this looks like a bigger, better movie.
Right.
And I just remember it was a packed theater on opening night. The opening scene with Nightcrawler at the White House,
Mm.
it's such a cool like an action sequence and a cool way to introduce that character, because that character is like a fan favorite from the comic books, and
That's right, as I understand.
they
Yes.
did a good job, I think, of adapting him for like the live action stuff. But I just remember the cheers during that opening scene,
I can
which like
imagine. I would have loved to have seen that with an
that
audience
first,
in
yeah,
theaters.
that
Yeah.
first X-Men movie does not have an opening scene like that. So I was like, whoa, okay, all right, wait, this is much bigger and better thing that we're in store for. So this is exciting. I just
Some,
that the way that sequence plays out is so
the stunt
cool.
choreography is bonkers.
Amazing. Yeah, I was kind of wondering like
Yes.
what was it like for you seeing that scene?
So it's interesting. It was like definitely entertaining. I couldn't help like this is something that I was like trying to not do while I was watching, but I couldn't help it. I was watching it in the context of having seen so many superhero
Other
movies since before this, so I couldn't help it like looking and noticing the ways in which this is very much an early 2000s action movie. So
Yeah.
there's tropes that's and directing and editing choices that stand out to me that haven't necessarily aged as well. So like all that aside, that wasn't like by any means like looking for negatives or anything. It was there'd be a scene, particularly in the open one, I was like, well, this is definitely edited like a 2000s action sequence, but I have to
I think
look
there's
at it
like
in the
even like the
context of this,
rotating like camera, like yeah,
definitely,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Cool at the time.
But regardless, yeah, it's definitely a trope of the time. But regardless of like how the editing may have aged, what you can't deny is how impressively orchestrated that whole sequence would be, and setting up the cameras in the right
Yeah,
place. And like honestly, I'd say even like the teleportation, like the CGI behind and the
yeah,
effects behind Nightcrawler's like jumping from here to there and the mist that he leaves behind, and all of a sudden he's behind this one guard and flips him, and then he's across the room at another one. Like all that orchestration would have been incredibly hard to
yeah.
pull off in a convincing way. And I'd say the whole team did a great job with that entire sequence, because he is all over the place, like making a fool
Yeah.
of this entire Secret Service
Secret
team.
Service.
Does it and takes them all on by one. It was like definitely a wicked action scene for sure.
And by the way, a scene if you're at home, because I have surround sound, was
Yeah,
so cool to like to hear like just zipping from like speaker to speaker is like a
that
if you
would
guys
be
have
really cool.
if you guys have that a good setup, you should that scene is a good test out scene for your surround sound. It was pretty awesome to listen to.
He Nightcrawler also looks like a demon to me. He's like freaky looking. He looks like a supernatural like ghost thing.
Yeah,
I don't know.
and I
He's a
think that's
freaky looking dude.
the good thing about. I mean, it's kind of like that in the comic books too. But I'm like glad that they kind of Alan Cumming, the way he plays him. He's not someone that's he's so mild mannered and religious and has faith and like
Yes.
to kind of go against like what he physically looks like. He has a lot of heart. The only reason that thing at the White House happened is because we learned later that
He was
Stryker.
a pawn.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, use something to like that can control mutants for like a short period of time.
Yes.
But yeah, man, that sequence is so. I was like wondering what it would be like to see that for the first time. Probably different on the big screen, but it was really cool the time when the movie came out to
I can
start
imagine.
it that way.
I was remember thinking this, like, I know that I would, as much as I like enjoyed the sequence, like while I was watching it, I remember like envious of people who could have experienced this on the big screen back in the day. And I know that I would have appreciated it much more if that's where I could have seen it, but still holds up, 20,
Yeah.
20 years later.
Later,
Like,
yeah, and that and
wicked opening sequence.
The John Ottman score during that scene too. I mean, is really. I mean, it's all of that adds to like why that sequence
Absolutely.
it's. I mean, yeah, there is some like early 2000s editing that goes on, but like the
Yeah.
way it's like choreographed and set up and done so convincingly. Because I remember before the movie came out, I was like, how are they going to really display his teleportation powers and how they're going to make that look like really good?
Right.
And that opening sequence, like you're just like, all right, then I'm all in on whatever they're going to do from here on out. And it's just what a way to like really start a comic book movie or action movie with a sequence that fans love that character. So it was probably a real treat for fans that really like Nightcrawler to really see
Yes.
them do that the way that they did it.
So, comic book question for you: is Nightcrawler German in the comic books like he is in the movie?
Yeah, and he also has some relation to Mystique as well. They do give them a scene together to kind of, I think for fans is like an Easter egg to have them interact. But I actually don't mind that they don't follow certain things in the comic book, like
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I guess some fans would be like, oh, they should mention like what their ties are, but it's not something that really like hurt the movie for me, because it's like, yeah, I know that adapting these things is pretty hard, and it's hard to include everything that fans are gonna want.
I'm gonna have to leave some things behind, no doubt.
Right, but I mean, those little nods where you have scenes of them together, it's kind of like, all right, well, I can see why they even gave them like a little moment, because fans will be like, oh, like they have like some kind of connection with each other. So, but yeah, he is actually Mystique's son in the comic books, which is what they don't tie that into the movie. But yeah, it's a big
no, they don't, do they? Okay.
Yeah, but
who's his father?
I don't want to butcher. It's spelled Azazel. Zizel. He is first appeared in Uncanny X-Men number 428. And yes, that's
my only other thing that I just have to get out, because this is like kind of something that bothers me in movies, and it's by no means that it like take away from my experience or anything, but I could tell that Alan Cumming was, and as convincing as his accent was, I know he was a non-German speaker. Right. At least I don't assume. I know he's from Scotland. I just know I could kind of tell he was putting on a German accent, and I just couldn't help but think I just wish they cast a German speaker in the role. Would have been a little bit more convincing, but I thought he did a fantastic job. I couldn't put on an accent to save my life, but that was just one little thing that kind of like just like if only. But then again,
they have some funny moments. Yeah, they have some funny moments with him. Like I like when we'll talk about it more later, but I love when he's on the jet and they've picked up like the other people from Bobby's house, and like Logan's like, who is this guy? He's like, oh, my name's Craig Wagner, but in the Munich circus, and he like cuts him off. He's like, save it.
That's right. Yes, that was
twice too. Like when he
Logan, I think.
Like who is this guy? And then like Storm like stops him from like. And she's like, yeah, he's a teleporter. Like, that's not important.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really funny. But yeah, I think he does a good job. But I could tell I understand what you're saying. That like,
you know what I'm saying? Like, you just know that he's putting the accent on. But that being said, he does a great job and he even has some German dialogue.
Yeah.
And he delivers it quite good. So, his performance overall was wicked as Nightcrawler. He was a cool character to see.
He was really good. I love like reintroducing some of the people. That's the good thing about sequels, though, is that you don't have to go through the hardship of it being an origin thing again. You only have to really introduce who the new people are, and like everyone else we've already know. So when they reintroduce, like, we call them the X kids, the younger generation of X kids, when they're at that, I think it's like a museum thing that they're all at with all the other kids from the school. So Shawn Ashmore played Iceman in the first one, but he's not in a lot of scenes. He has a really, really small part, and the fact that it expanded into a much larger role in the second one is pretty cool. I think
it was awesome to see him. I had no idea he was in those movies.
Yeah,
so I
think it's like, I think he has like 2 or 3 scenes in X-Men, and it does set up that he kind of has like he likes Rogue, but it's not a big part at all. I mean, I think it's cool that they brought him back.
Okay.
Because the kid that plays Pyro briefly in X-Men was not brought back. Aaron Stanford did not play him in the first one. Someone else did. Yeah, Aaron Stanford now playing Pyro, and then of course we have Rogue, and now we already can tell that Pyro is like the asshole, the rebel of the three.
Right.
I love the way in these movies where when they introduce what their powers are and what they can do. So in that sense is when they're getting like uh, asked about the lighter and like whatever and like from the other kids at the museum, and
Right.
then the other guy starts smoking a cigarette, and then he just winks, and
Yeah,
then like the whole
just
thing.
inside the museum, right? Like,
Yeah. And then you get to see Bobby use his powers by like
yeah,
putting the guy out
it
with
was a slick little way of showing what they're capable of.
yeah,
Definitely.
and I also love how they had like Xavier just stop everybody, and like everyone just
Yeah.
stops in motion, and like yeah. So I thought that was a cool way to kind of reintroduce them and introduce the new Pyro, in this new movie. What did you think about them overall, like the younger generation of X-Men? I
I
should
liked them a
say.
lot, honestly. They didn't like where normally I think maybe some other movies might have had a younger cast that kind of I think they would have made like played up probably their youthfulness or their immaturity maybe more
Yeah,
nowadays than I think they did in these 2000s editions. They honestly they were like kind of the heart of the movie for me. I honestly really enjoyed them. I bought into to Rogue and Iceman's like budding romance. It's not something I really expected going in the movie that there would be any of that. Like
yeah,
I knew that there was something between Jean Grey and Logan, but really didn't know much because, like I said earlier, I'd seen little bits and the big climactic scene in X3 I was remember. So I thought we'd
yeah,
get a little bit if there was going to be romance in the X-Men universe. I was expecting it from them, but normally that stuff I wouldn't really like care for. But I
yeah.
bought it between those characters. I liked the dynamic between Pyro and Magneto. They have one of my actually probably I think my favorite line of dialogue from the movie is a moment between them on the jet
Awesome. Yeah,
where
that seems very good actually.
that scene
Yeah,
is awesome. He's like,
yeah.
"What? I think what's he do? He asks. He's kind of like
He
inquiring about
asked him,
what Pyro can do.
yeah, he asked him what his name is, and he
What his
says
name is. He's
he
like your
says his name
true
is
name.
John. He's like, "What's your real
Yeah.
name, John?" And he says Pyro, and he says what he
Yes.
can do with his, and then he gets
And then
not frustrated, but he's like, "I can't." He's I can only manipulate the fire. I can't create it.
create it. Yes.
And then he's like, "You're a god amongst insects. I'll let anybody tell you different." And like that,
Exactly.
and that
And
little
I
moment
love
just
that.
sets up like what will eventually happen. Like he's gonna like turncoat a bit and not be a
Yep.
part of the good guys. And it's so cool. It's such a small little scene. It's not like a big like moment, but it was so
Well,
well acted
you're
by both of
right.
them and well written by both by the
Well written,
scriptwriters.
absolutely, and definitely well delivered. But even though it's not a huge, like, revelatory scene, looking at it is definitely like from Pyro's perspective, this is like a pretty big, significant character and yes, enemy, a frenemy, I guess, if you will,
Yeah,
who is like giving him this encouragement and mentorship in a moment. I could
yeah,
definitely see that being impactful for his character and ultimately leads him to kind of switching coats, like you'd said, and joining him. I
yeah,
totally buy into that, even though I honestly like how subtle it is instead of
yeah,
a direct recruitment sort of
yeah.
approach. I think that would have been too on the nose. So I really, really enjoyed that was one of my standout moments of the movie. As much of a smaller moment it was
Yeah, and
definitely impactful.
it pays off too with like another just small moment where they see him before they take off at towards the end of
That's
the
right.
movie,
Yeah, like where is
and
he? And then it's fine.
they look at each other and they're like, "All right, should we go get him?" Like, that's all that says, and then the next
Yep.
shot he's like on the helicopter with him. So
Yep.
I'm glad that you said there's not like this big like I'm making this big revelation. I'm gonna like switch teams or like
Right. It's just a
enjoin
little
them.
seed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like just enough because he already feels like a rebel, right? He doesn't really feel like he belongs probably with, especially compared to like Bobby, who's like the nice, the nice one, the wholesome one compared
Right.
of the two. But yeah, I'm glad you like pointed out that movie because that is one of my favorite scenes when that brief interaction that they have with
Hmm.
each other. And I think it's really well written and really well acted by both of them.
Yeah.
I
I
thought.
also was surprised at how much I really liked Magneto. Because I
Oh
mean, I don't
really?
have. Yeah, I like. I mean, I didn't expect not to like him, but I guess I thought of him as more what I've seen of the X-Men movies. I've seen more of Michael Fassbender's
Fassbender.
interpretation of Magneto, and I really like what I've seen from him. And like, I just have a huge adoration for Michael Fassbender. So like, I
Yeah.
just feel like naturally I'm more inclined to like that interpretation. So nothing against Ian McKellen. I've seen him and loved him in many roles. I just like hadn't seen. I wasn't. I guess expecting to really like old man Magneto as much. I wouldn't expect it to have like resonated with him, but I love the dynamic he brought to the X-Men. He's also, at least in the second one, I can't speak to the first, he's not as much of an antagonist as I really expected him to
Right.
be. And I really kind of a refreshing approach for like a villain, if you will. Like he's very much like
Yeah.
pro mutant. He's on the same side. He doesn't hate mutants. He's in very and
He just doesn't
on
like
one hand,
humans
like
because
would
of how they
support them. He doesn't like humans, and
like
that's
him
where
because of
like
how
the
how they
conflict
treat.
between them.
Yeah.
Exactly. I just like that the conflict isn't so one on one, like one against the other. It's just like the X-Men and Charles are trying to stop him from destroying humanity, but he's not
Right.
trying to destroy villain or mutants. I just
Yeah.
thought that was. I guess I wasn't really as like informed on his motivations as I was before watching the
Right.
movie, and really was surprised at how much I actually quite enjoyed his presence throughout the movie.
Yeah, you kind of hear this comparison a bit when they compare the characters in the comic books. Is that Charles Xavier is like Martin Luther King Jr. and Magneto is like the Malcolm X, who's more like radicalized and like
I,
they have very
that is
similar
a great comparison.
like they have similar if they could come together on this one thing they'd probably be a great team, but like
Yeah,
the whole peaceful let's coexisting that Magneto is like we clearly they've shown that they can't do that because of how they treat us and they basically want to wipe us out.
their
So that's all
experiences don't let
far,
them see
far
the same
different.
side, right?
Right.
Yeah,
So like that's
and I
always been an
love that.
interesting
That's
thing in
great
the
writing.
very interesting dynamic in the comic books, and I think they've carried that on into the movies too. He is like the main villain in the first one. I do like what you're saying here though. Like, yes,
I
he's a
figured.
villain here, but like, the real villain here is Stryker. That is who is the main antagonist in X2. And I also
Right.
like since Magneto is not quite the main villain, I love the kind of uneasy alliance that has to happen midway through the movie where it's like we need each other, the kind of thing.
It was convincing. I
Yeah,
love that aspect of the movie as well. I love the whole the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of kind
yeah,
of, not that that was necessarily applicable here, but to a degree it was, and
yeah.
I've always loved that sort of like fighting
And him and
intense
Charles
alliance, if you
respect
will.
each other. Like, I mean, it's in
Yeah,
the comic books too.
definitely.
Even in like, one of the best scenes is at the end of the first one. They're playing like chess together while Magneto he's already in that plastic prison that he gets introduced in
Oh,
the
okay.
second one, and their dialogue together, you could tell there's like mutual respect because they were friends. Like they were
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
friends, but their ideals on how to handle this situation just diverted, and they're
Drove them
not the
apart.
same.
Right.
Drove them apart. So like that's always been a really interesting dynamic, and I'm glad they carried that on into these movies because even like you could tell even when he explains to the X-Men how Stryker even knows about Cerebro, you can tell that he doesn't feel good about how it happened. Like he was forced to do it. Like Stryker, like
Right.
did what he basically did with Nightcrawler and what he did with Deathstrike, like controlling him, and that's how he's pulling the information from him. So you can tell that
Right.
like there is this mutual like respect and admiration that they have for one another, even though they're on the complete opposite ends of like how to deal with this whole fight between humans and mutants. But
Yes.
it's really interesting writing, and it's really, I think having someone like Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, they're just veterans, and they could sell that dynamic really well. They can, like I said, they
Yes.
can read
And they're
anything
friends
and
in
make
real
it,
life.
and they're friends in
So
real
their
life. So
chemistry
like,
is
and also,
immaculate.
yeah, they have really great chemistry. I also love finding out too that also who became really friendly, Rebecca Romijn and Ian McKellen became very close while doing this. They had like a
Remind me
complete
who Rebecca Romijn is.
she played Mystique. They
Oh,
had
right.
like
Yes.
they had a complete like shorthand with each other, even though they don't have like a lot of dialogue. They would just throw in stuff like while they were just standing with each other. Like he just said he loved working with
Oh,
her, and he loved working
cool.
with him, and they kind of just were like, like we're both like kind of like the badasses, the bad guys here. Like let's bond over that. And they did, and they became very close while they were actually making all the movies that they were in together. But they said particularly that second one because they had more to do together. Like Mystique's not in. I mean, she's in the first one. I mean, it's a big ensemble. She doesn't have like her role's bigger in X2 compared to what she gets to do in X1.
Right.
And again, of course, not a lot of lines, but I don't think it's a character that really needs a lot of lines. This is all about how she
No,
looks and how she
she's a
moves.
henchman. She doesn't need to be. Yeah, exactly.
And I've always said this. It's so crazy because Jennifer Lawrence is the actress of the two who have played her. Right? Jennifer Lawrence played her in the newer X-Men
Yes.
movies. I've always been like, I
Right.
prefer Rebecca Romijn and like, what she brought to that role without
Cool.
saying much. She just the part and she moves a certain way. And I think it has a lot to do with Rebecca Romijn being a model at one point in real life. Like she knows how to move her body and like Mystique moves in a very specific way. And I guess that's the best way to kind of put it. And she
You know
sells
what?
that a
Like,
bit better.
I don't feel there's much of a other than like her character. I mean, she essentially does appear naked quite a
Yeah.
bit, right? But I don't feel like there's much of an attempt to like overtly sexualize her character. But
I don't think so
she
either.
comes across as sexual just naturally. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like it's partly part of in her name, kind of like alludes to there's something sexual about her character that is just like I think
Yeah.
like you said, that plays into her the actress that portrayed her being a model
Yeah.
fits completely and sells her performance. One little interesting note that it's kind of like, so yeah, so this isn't the actress performing, but like, when you think about it, Mystique does have a lot more dialogue in the movie than you'd think because she is portraying
as other people.
people. There's other actors delivering her dialogue, but she's in it more than I even thought until right now. Like, because she portrays like 3 or 4 other people.
Yeah, that is very true. Cool. That is very true. Yeah. So yeah, she's just a fun part, and she's just a fun character too. Like, I mean, it's like a fun fun. If you're going to be the henchman, it needs to be kind of interesting, and I think she does a good job of making her interesting enough. And she also has like a small moment with Nightcrawler that I think that really works when he's basically like, you can look like anybody, you can look normal. Like, why would you just want to stay like that? And she just has that short line of like, because we shouldn't have to. Like, you can just tell in that one bit of dialogue that she's completely fine with what she looks like and who she is. And like, and I thought that was pretty interesting to have those 2 characters do that, because they both are, one, it's cool for fans who are like, oh, well, in the comic books, this is what their relationship is, but also cool to have like someone who he would probably want to look normal, because he wants to fit in with everyone else, and her being like, oh, you shouldn't have to do something like that. Which
exactly.
I thought was a pretty cool moment.
Right.
Between those 2.
Says a lot by saying a little with her character.
Yeah. And she does get to appear as Rebecca Romijn, scene in the bar where she has to put the like basically metal iron, whatever, in the security guard to help bust out of his plastic prison,
which is one of the coolest like kills / prison break.
Oh yeah, that sequence is so good.
That was so creative. I love that.
Before I get to that one, I'm gonna ask you first, because what did you think about? Brian Cox was in this?
Nope, not until I saw his name.
So what did you think about it? Him as, I mean, he sells the just the overall hatred that man has, like, really well.
Honestly, I love Bryan Cox. I think casting him in that movie was a great decision. He would have definitely, I'm sure people would have went just to go see him. He definitely would have been icing on the cake for that movie. It's his, I guess I just wasn't like in love with his character. You know what I mean?
Motivations
as a villain. Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like, especially like after I watched, like, Joe Blow actually had a video on X2. They were like part of their Marvel Revisited series. So I watched that, and they kind of helped me appreciate more of his character, because they were able to nicely and concisely rope together his aspirations, and way more concisely than the 2 hour and 15-minute runtime could. So after watching their video, I kind of like appreciated more about like Stryker's role in the movie. But Bryan Cox, is nothing against him. It's just like playing. I'd rather just see him be a little bit more explosive in a role like he is in Troy. That's kind of like where I find, like, I like Bryan Cox the most. I feel like they could have had like another, like, been kind of like a lesser actor play Stryker and give them the chance to really make Stryker their own, where I think Bryan Cox is like too big for that role. It might be, that might be an unpopular opinion. It just, he as a villain, I guess, didn't like blow me away, but his motivations and everything was like written very slickly, and I enjoyed how he was written, his motivations against why he hated mutants. That was all good. Something about it like just felt lacking for me a little bit. It didn't detract, but it didn't like hook me, I guess.
That's
but
fair.
Bryan Cox is always awesome to see him act.
A welcome present. Yeah, I mean, I think what kind of makes him scary for me as a villain is that he feels very real. Like, that feels like a guy that exists in real life, that's a great point. Who was so displeased by these people that he doesn't understand, and then knowing why, because his son, because there's so many like themes that go through these X-Men movies where, like, oh, you can like say how this person feels about mutants is how someone might say about someone who is gay or black, or like that's like that allegory is like in there. That's why I think X-Men movies are so interesting, because like if you are toying with that real life kind of stuff, as far as people not being tolerant of other people who aren't like them.
I'm just like kind of coming to this conclusion right now. I'm just noticing throughout this conversation right now, and like what you just said about him why he's scary, because he can exist in real life. There's a lot of comparisons of him to like Hitler, for instance. Someone who has skin in the game in terms of like politics and experience, and using that malice towards a different group to sort of draft legislation to directly oppress them. I'm just saying that, honestly, thinking about it, I kind of like appreciate writing of his character a lot more, thinking about that now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he's the one that orchestrates the attack on the White House, also he can have like his own agenda like pushed, which
that's right.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you felt that way about it. I mean, I guess I just like Bryan Cox and everything I see him in, for the most part, and I think he's better in the first half of the movie. I mean, I think they kind of, I don't want to say dumb him down towards the end, like when he's trying to escape. I mean, I think there's not a lot you can do with him at that point once he realizes his plan's kind of
Right.
falling apart.
Yeah.
But he has like a really strong scene where he first brings Xavier to where they're at, and he's explaining to him like why he's doing what he's doing, and then Xavier realizes that he's using his son, like he's experimented on his son in order to like figure out a way to like destroy all mutants. And you would
Right.
just really see the anger like when he like basically tells him like, no, this is your son. He's like, no, my son is dead. Like, no, like this doesn't matter to
Right.
me anymore. Like he is now an experiment for like, in his mind, the greater good or a bigger cause to get rid of
Exactly.
other mutants. Yeah, which which makes him scary. I mean, I like when I was watching it the other day, I was like, that. I mean, you've known that from seeing the movie a few times, but
Yes.
you see, I mean, like the Hitler comparison is very real, but you're actually seeing it also play out in the news with certain people and groups now, even.
That's right.
So I think that's why the X-Men stories and movies can be a bit timeless, because like it seems like the world is constantly dealing with something like that, and
Absolutely.
it mirrors that in a very real way.
I'm
Just
thinking
using,
like a rewatch down the road will probably open me up more to his character in particular. But I'm taking in a lot of things at the first watch.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Some things
Yeah.
I don't appreciate, but it's Brian Cox, and thinking now, just reflecting on after the watch, like his character, his motivations, how truly maniacal he really is. I've really come to appreciate since that watch. But these are my initial feelings after watching it.
Yeah.
One thing that I can't get over, and this is just a petty little tidbit, and I get this is from a comic, so this is nothing against the movie, but his name, it's just so
William Stryker.
Stryker, like too on the nose for me, like it's a villain name, but also like a military figure villain name. I don't know. It was just a little bit too cheesy for me, but that's again such a small tidbit.
Yeah,
just
and I
something
know
off the gate, I was like, whatever.
And I know you've seen the first movie, but remember certain things from it. So that whole character with Senator Kelly that Mystique is impersonating,
right?
He is in the first movie. He was the one that was leading the charge against mutants. He wanted to create the Mutant Registration Act, and basically they would have to so every mutant would have to identify themselves, and then he gets kidnapped by Magneto and the other mutants in the first one, and they essentially they experiment on him and turn him into one of them, and the experiment doesn't hold, and he eventually dies. But before he dies, he kind of sees, because he's saved a bit by the X-Men, like trying to keep him alive, he kind of sees the good in them, because there's one line in the first one where Xavier tells them, we're not all bad. That's not like all of us. And then he says, like, tell that to the one that did this to me, like who experimented on him, basically. And right before he dies, he does kind of see that there are good, and there are, like with any, there's good and bad people in anything. So like I was wondering what that character would look like for you, if you're like, who is this guy? Like, was she impersonating?
So yeah, no, I had no idea watching it, but I did after watching that Joe Blow video. They kind of explained that, and they showed a little sequence of his death in the first one. He kind of turned, it looks like he's some sort of like liquid, like metal blob or something, metal colored blob. So but that got me wondering, is his death like disguised or masked in some sense?
So
in the White House.
So Mystique, who appears to have died in the first X-Men movie, she gets stabbed by Logan, but she ends up surviving. She then impersonates him, and it actually reverses a lot of the things that he was trying to pass that would go against you, which is kind of like a cool thing too. But
must be a busy lady.
But she was around to do that, and also again trying to figure out a way to get to see Magneto, Eric, in prison, so she could get him out, or find a good way to get him out.
And does she ever find a
does she ever? Does she ever?
I love that scene.
There's some great action scenes in this movie. Also, too, she has a bigger role in this second movie too. We get a lot of the first hints that something's going on with Jean Grey. Like, she can't really control like her powers lately. I love that she has more to do. I actually think Famke Janssen is very good in that role. What's funny is that in the first movie, I didn't think she screamed Jean Grey, like from what I know from the comic books. But by the second movie, you come to like her a lot and actually feel for her a bit, and and her inability to control her powers. My only gripe has something to do with her. If you're gonna give her more to do, I wish they would have gave her dude more to do, because Cyclops and James Marsden don't have a lot to do, and he is the only one, I think, of like, everyone seems to have like a bigger role in the first movie, except for him. And I don't understand why. I still to this day not know
written down to
why does he get sidelined for half the movie, and like early on too. He gets like okay, he gets to fight, cool. And Deathstrike basically knocks him out, and then he's
Yeah.
gone. He's gone for a good chunk of all the good stuff, and then comes back towards the end.
Yeah, he's
And
like gone for like the 2/3 of the movie. Or
I'm glad you wrote that down. I was wondering what you thought about like because James Marsden looks the part. Like he actually
he's
isn't
awesome.
bad. He isn't
I didn't even
bad
know
in
it
the
was
role at
him.
all. Yeah, and it's hard to tell with the visor and everything on too, right? Like,
Yeah,
if that character has to just look good, like the jawline and all that, very
exactly.
similar to like Batman or something like that. You have to have good mouth.
That's right.
Yeah,
But, like as a non like X-Men enthusiast, I guess like Cyclops is definitely one of those pivotal members that like I can visualize. Like
he's
a
the leader of the team.
I didn't even really know that, to tell you the truth, but yeah, definitely he's somebody that I envision when I think about the X-Men, like especially like James Marsden's interpretation. Is his character brought into the 2010?
So he's in the third one. He dies.
Okay.
Jean Grey kills him.
Nice.
She's fully turned into Dark Phoenix.
Yeah.
She can't control her powers. But thankfully, since that third movie's trash, X-Men Days of Future Past, because of them going back in time, they so everyone's fine.
So is James Marsden playing him in Days of Future Past?
He played a cameo. They were like showing the X school again and showed that everyone was alive. Because like, and a lot of the characters got killed off in that war that they were in. So like they show that like by doing what they did, they could change time basically. And Jean was alive. She wasn't dead as Phoenix anymore. Like James Cyclops was back. Storm was alive again. So I sometimes I'm not cool with rounding stuff, but in the case of
because X3 was such a disaster, it's okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with you guys just pretending like that didn't happen.
Fair enough, understandable. But no,
he's weird. It's weird how sidelined that he is in it, and I can't even. It's not. I've tried looking it up. Like, was he filming something else? I never found anything like that. It just seems like that's the way the role was written, and I also feel like it's unintentional. Like kind of funny. There's a scene after he's under Stryker's control towards the end of the movie. He attacks Jean, and then she almost goes full Phoenix and like knocks him like clear across the room. And he comes back and he's good again. And Jean is running with him towards the other X-Men. And keep in mind that Storm hasn't seen Cyclops most of the movie, since like that one scene they have together when Logan comes back. That's the only time that she's seen him. She doesn't say like, Scott, are you okay? Or Jean, are you okay? She just goes, Jean, are you okay? Like she just references her, and he's just kind of like there. I was like, why didn't you mention him? She hasn't like seen him the entire movie. He's just like, Jean.
There's something going on. I wonder why that isn't addressed. I'd love to know.
He's the butt of the joke. I mean, when they take his car and they play the radio, and it plays like "Bye Bye Bye" by NSYNC for like a second. Like they make him the butt of jokes and stuff. I mean, he probably would listen to NSYNC. I feel like Cyclops would. It's like,
hey, drives a bitchin' car though.
He does have a bitchin' car, and what James Marsden gets to do in the movie is pretty decent. I just wish, like, if you're gonna expand her character and have her dealing with like what this is going, like, since they're a couple, that they should go through that together. And I know there's also the fan base that's like, what, her and Logan have a flirtatious thing, and they want to see that play out more. I'm glad they didn't go. I mean, they did kiss, but like, I'm glad they didn't like fully really go there. I mean, it's the flirtatious stuff is fine, but like, yeah, I mean, he's experiencing this big thing, and you would think they would want to like have them experience that as a couple in the movie, but then like, no, they send him on something with Xavier, and then he gets knocked out. Like my buddy was like, well, I mean, they take Xavier out. I was like, no, I mean, he's not with them, but he's in the movie. I mean, he's in other parts in the movie, like.
Oh yeah, he gets like screen time. He's just not with like the whole cast, I guess.
After that scene where he gets knocked out, it's like you almost forget that Cyclops was even in it, because he doesn't really have he doesn't have a ton of scenes before that.
All he really does, like when there's any action going on, is he gets his ass kicked by two girls. That's really what happens both times. He
gets to fire off a shot at Deathstrike. That's about it. And then she does this like crazy, like flying kick thing.
Yeah, knocks his ass out. I also found that his beam or whatever seemed a little bit inconsistent. I don't know how his powers work though. If like maybe
I think so. Like visor, he can adjust it to make it like how powerful it could be.
Okay.
And since the X-Men are all about not necessarily like killing folks, I think that's why sometimes he does. Because I'm like, why don't you
incapacitate?
Why don't you just full blast her?
Right. Yeah. Go Homelander on her.
Yeah, like she clearly wants to kill you. So
right.
But yeah, I think that's why. And you actually see that a bit in the scene where Storm creates the tornadoes when when they're flying out. She does it not to harm any of them. She gets them like off their back, even though
Right.
they're gonna fire off missiles at them.
But yeah, they're good
I mean,
guys. And
they're good guys, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad that they expand on Jean's character. I just wish they would have done the same thing with
mhm.
Scott and Cyclops.
Jean is another character, kind of like Rogue, where I did not have a grip on capabilities that she has. Like she seems to have
Yeah.
like powers seem to like not change dramatically, but fluctuate a little bit. I don't. What is like the nuance?
So
of her
she's telepathic and she's a telekinetic, so she can move stuff with her mind and she can read minds. They actually hint at this in The Last Stand. They do talk about this in Dark Phoenix, and that's one of the good things that those movies do, is that she is almost, if not as powerful as Xavier, if she really, but she doesn't have like the same control that
right
he has
kind of like
over
an Anakin
his.
Skywalker sort of
Yeah.
character. It seems.
And even though they're doing the whole Phoenix setup a bit differently than a lot differently compared to the comic books, I do think it works for the film that it's just like she just can't physically, her powers are getting stronger and she's having an issue controlling them. That same scene in the jet where she disables one of the missiles and then she can't do it with the other one.
Right.
I think that was a good scene to just portray, like at some point she can do it and at some point she can't. And
right.
I think they sell that point pretty well. I wish it would have paid off in the next movie, but I think they do a good job setting it up. What could have been. They do a good job setting it up, though. There, at least there's that. I do want to get to the Magneto sequence. I know you want to talk about that, but the first big, I guess, action sequence that we do get is the attack on the school, the X Mansion, which is, again, in the theater, was a really cool fucking scene because it's the first scene. I mean, we've seen Wolverine do his stuff in the first one, but it's the first one where, like, we get some claws and he actually, like,
berserk, right?
I mean, yeah, you actually see him have somebody. Like, it's not just, there's no cutaway. It's kind of nice to see him go, like, full Wolverine. Right. It's a really well done action sequence, though, like, and it's also littered with Easter eggs if you're an X-Men fan.
Okay.
There you get to see a bit of Shadowcat, the girl that's like running through like the walls at one point, the girl that falls through her bed and then goes to the walls. You see a little bit of Colossus, the guy who turns into the silver.
I noticed him. I had to Google if that's who he was because obviously he's very relevant in Deadpool. I was like, yeah, looks like the same dude. Anyway, I was really happy with that. That was
and then you get a bit of Siren, who's like a lesser known character from the comic books, but she's the girl that screams and then like they can't like then, like, and then so the one guy shoots her with the dart like right in her neck, and she just goes like stop screaming. I think it's a cool sequence for that. It's also a cool sequence for like to show the other like kids too, and like why it's important for them to want to protect them, and then like it also shows that Stryker's willing to do anything, like kidnap children because what he plans on doing with them. And I also like the only frustrating thing about sometimes with the X-Men movies. I get that in the case of like Iceman, Pyro, not so much Rogue, because like she can't really use her powers the way she needs to, or she hasn't really honed that yet.
Right.
There's a lot of them running around and trying to escape, but like, dude, like you can fire like ice from your hands and you can do stuff with your lighter. I mean, they could have easily like took out some of those people on their own.
Definitely.
I guess we're supposed to show that they're like are still young and they don't know like exactly how they're not in combat like the rest of them. But dude, I mean, you got powers, use them.
I mean, it's a great sequence for Wolverine.
Yeah, that whole
it's great for him to showcase his powers. That was the first kind of moment in the movie too where the PG rating kind of got to me because there's honestly I was surprised at some of the language that was used throughout the movie that I wouldn't have expected. Like they get away with some swearing, no F-bombs or anything, but more than I would have like given credit for PG-13
like
2003. Particularly when that first guy that kills against the fridge in the kitchen, like not a drop of blood anywhere in that entire sequence at the house or the school. I would have liked a little bit of that, but there's this random shot later in the movie. It's a flashback of Logan literally drenched in blood.
It's almost like they had to. It's almost like they had to choose. Like you only get one.
Right. But which one do you want? Dudes up. I would have liked some sort of violence, but anyway, just a little. That
was a little bit of a complaint about the first movie is that they didn't really fully show him do what he can do, and like I mean I agree with you that sequence would work a lot better if there was a little bit of blood. That would happen if he impaled you with his claws.
6 adamantium claws right into your body.
Right into your body. And then he gets the one guy in the foot, like when he's like waiting around the corner, and you just like, that one's really good. And then they just show him full on like slicing, like when he's running down the hallway, but there's no like splashes of blood. I probably would
Nah,
have
that'd
added
be
a little
nice.
something to it. And
Definitely.
I also love when the kids look like they're cornered and he just jumps from like the balcony and like takes out those
Yeah,
rings and like and then flips the other one with his claws. I was like, so cool. Like the entire theater
it's
like
pretty
went to
badass.
tears after that on opening night. It was
Oh, I can imagine.
so much fun.
One of the better action sequences for sure. And it's all at night and shot in the dark was super cool
Yeah.
too.
And
Yeah, it looks gorgeous.
and that's when we get the connection between Stryker and Logan, that there is some kind of connection between the two of them, or that he knows him. I love how like that initially like the kids were gonna run off, and they're like, "No, we got to go back for Logan." And Pyro's like, "He can take care of himself." They were just gonna leave him there, and they do go back and help him. Actually, the on my TV, the effect for the ice wall that X-Men builds to create the barrier between them
Right.
looks really good. Yeah, you could tell parts of it were an effect to like show it growing, but like
Right.
the wall itself looked pretty cool. I
I
thought,
thought
like,
yeah, no, it was good use of assuming CGI.
yeah, like, so maybe some practical stuff to create it when he's touching it or whatever. But like, I thought that
Exactly.
looked pretty cool.
As it was
And
getting built though, like yeah, no, I thought it would definitely be a moment where 2000s CGI may have shown its age, but
yeah,
it honestly it held up for me as well.
and now you can use your powers. By the way,
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, that's such a it's, coming off of the Nightcrawler scene, which is you get that sequence. They're like another bigger, better action sequence compared to what anything that's in the first movie. They're just like they're
Right.
just continuing to like top what they did before, which is kind of cool to see. Which leads into another big action sequence, which we've kind of brought up a little bit: the prison escape for Xavier. I love how it's handled. I love that Mystique, in human form as Rebecca Romijn, not real in real life, but like you see her,
Yeah.
and she, when I first saw the movie, I was like, what is she doing? Like, what is she putting in him? And I wasn't paying attention at like, and I was like, oh, and then like it's gonna be some kind of metal so he can like get out,
Extract it from Buddy.
extract it. And I love that when he goes into the prison, it detects it at first, and the guy's like, oh, let me do that again, and then it doesn't because it's it's moving around in his body essentially.
Right.
And I love McKellen's just such a good actor when he gets to the room and he just quietly just like, there's something different about you. I know. He's just like, what could it be? And he just lifts him up like that. I mean, you want to remember how badass Magneto is in
Right.
that moment. And it's actually a really, I mean, I guess you see a little bit of blood from him like
See a
extracting
little bit
it.
of mist, yeah.
Mist. Yeah, that whole sequence is amazing. Like
And
it's
he
so
says, yeah, too much iron is bad.
in your blood.
Or something like
It's
that.
too
Yeah,
much iron in your blood.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That was pretty bad.
I think uses it to create like the one thing so you can stand on and just float across to the other side, and then like fucking pelts the other guards with. Yeah, it's a really brilliant fucking scene.
Does he not do a similar thing with a coin in the later movies?
I think he does actually. I'm forgetting what the exact sequence is, but I think he does. Yeah.
I can picture Michael Fassbender flinging change at somebody, like just dissecting them.
Yeah, so
But,
like
anyway,
yeah,
super
that
cool
moment is
for Magneto.
it's cool to see him get him out, so like we can actually see him be full on Magneto and not like in prison anymore. Yeah, that sequence is pretty damn good. But then it's like it's hard for me to pick which set pieces in these movies, like in this one in particular, like I like the most, because when you whole sequence at the house when they go to Bobby's home to like kind of hide out in Boston because they're waiting for Jean and Storm to get back.
Right.
That I love that scene. Well, I mean, it ends pretty. The pyro stuff is amazing. Like that's one of my favorite moments in the movie. But it's again like other X-Men movies I think are so good and the way they're written. The whole scene about him talking to his parents about being a mutant, it almost sounds similar to how a kid would talk to their parents like they were like coming out or something like that. And
it is a coming out scene.
A coming out scene.
Yeah.
And when she says stuff like, like, have you tried not being sounds like here? And like, and I love
absolutely.
I love when he's like, when the mom's like, I probably, this is probably all my fault. And he's like, actually, they determined that like males carry the gene, so it's his fault. It's such a moment. But yeah, it's such a really well written scene. I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
It's been heavy handed, but I think it was just enough where it's like, okay, this is like basically the same thing. Where they're trying to use this as like this is what this.
They're not hammering it on the head too much or anything. You also get like a aspect of like the family rejection and his brother who like calls the police, who's like not on board. Yeah. And like that, the sequence that leads to is another good action set piece. There's a scene where you get to see the kids use their powers, or Pyro, I guess in particular.
Pyro. So that's another scene that played very well in the movie theater on opening night, because you've been waiting for him to like. He only has that small thing at the museum, and then you're like waiting to see,
Right.
like, okay, what is this guy? What can he do? I think that scene is also jarring too, because when they're have the guns on them and they're telling Wolverine to like put the knives down, and he's like, I can't. And I think he's going to show them that he can retract them, but the guy like
Right.
full on just shoots him before he even gets like anything out. That scene is jarring too, but like because I feel like that happens, like there's a lot of like action in real life where it's, you know, people are like doing things before they fully understand, like people in law enforcement and stuff like that, before they fully understand
Yep.
what a situation is. So that scene played differently for me in rewatch watching it, because it was like, wow, this that felt like a bit real. Like that, if someone was freaked out, like a cop was freaked out and didn't understand what this was,
100%.
that could easily he shoots him in the head, like
in the middle of the forehead. Like, damn. At that,
Yeah.
like not knowing, obviously, like I had known that Logan has regenerative powers, but I can imagine people not being like that familiar with X-Men property, thinking, "Oh wow, Logan just got domed and he's out." I can imagine the first time you were seeing that scene, like, holy shit, what?
Yeah. And it's
he
another
doesn't,
good example.
He doesn't really come back until after Pyro saves the day.
Pyro saves the day,
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because like I love the score in that scene too. John Ottman's score gets really, it's a build up to what Pyro's about to do. And you know, just again, like it's not like it's a huge part, but he does a lot with what he's given, like being a part of that ensemble.
Definitely.
And like I think he's probably one of the cooler characters, the newer characters that they introduced in this.
Agreed.
And his display of power, that scene is just fucking awesome. It's like a really cool action sequence. And he does, you know, it's funny, he saves their lives, but they kind of like the way that Logan looks at him after it's all done, after like Rogue takes his power and like puts the flames out, and then Logan gets back up, and he just looks at him, and then he like looks at him like, what? Like, what was I supposed to do? Like he does save them, but then they but then they kind of like allude to like, you know, when they're getting chased by like the jets, and they're like, you know, why are they after us? And like Logan's like, yeah, I wonder why. And he like kind of looks at him like, this is because of you. Basically,
this is what happens when you're not, you know, when you don't keep your powers in check. But then again, this is like just too, like it makes sense that this is a kid that hasn't experienced combat yet, that hasn't really had the chance to, you know, fully display his powers. He's naturally going to probably, you know, go a little bit above and beyond when it comes down to it, when he's scared, when he's confronted by guns. Like this is that's what's going to happen. So
and
again, just another bit of good writing.
What they do in that scene too is, as it's progressing, they kind of show that he looks like he's enjoying it. Like it doesn't look like he wants to stop. And I think that Rogue keeps looking at him, and like the look on his face is just like he is fully enjoying like causing all this destruction. I think it is funny that earlier I was like, why don't you guys use your powers? It's probably a good example as to why they shouldn't, because he can't really control them the way he probably should.
Exactly.
But yeah, I thought that was really interesting how they played that. And you also get another quiet moment with him before that, when they're in the house, that you can tell that he doesn't feel like he quite belongs with the rest of them, when he's looking at all the pictures at Bobby's house and like a family, and you can tell that he doesn't really, he doesn't have that, or he doesn't feel connected to the rest of them probably the way that he should.
That's a good pickup, because I can remember the shots of the family photographs, but never really made the connection that it's him that's looking at. What's Pyro's real name again?
John. Oh, the actor?
John, I never.
John,
No, the character. Yeah. I guess I didn't like clue in that it was him observing them and making that connection to him. But that's a great point.
Yeah, and then that's like, every time when I was watching it again, I was like, I kept going back to like that opening night and like seeing that scene. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, why is this so much cooler than the first one? Doing so much more stuff.
That's what a good sequel does, right?
Good sequel does. I will ask you this, since like the sequence after that does involve like the jet, and I mentioned how Storm creating the tornadoes and stuff. Halle Berry also has more to do with this movie compared to the first one. A lot of that had to do, I think a lot of that had to do with winning an Oscar for Monsters Ball before they started doing this. If you look at the main poster for X2, it's like Hugh Jackman, big face, Halle Berry, big face. Like they look like they're the leads. And clearly she's not the lead, right? Like she is.
Definitely.
She doesn't but she does have more to do compared to what she did in the first movie.
Big supporting character, no doubt.
Yeah. But I mean, there are a lot of people that are on the fence about her portrayal of Storm across the movies. I think this is the strongest showing of her.
Okay.
She has like a much bigger role in the third one, but it's like it almost feels forced. It's like, oh, because they had to give her a bigger role. Where this felt like
Okay.
more natural. It felt like a natural progression. Like it felt natural that she would be the one that might connect a bit with Nightcrawler in a couple of scenes, because she's like in the comic book, she's more like the mother figure she's nurturing. She's second in command to Cyclops in the comic book, so like she also a leader. I know Halle Berry wanted them to show that a bit more about her, and they don't really do that. They show that she's powerful. Of course, she can control the fucking weather. But
Mhm.
I don't know. What did you think of her in this movie in particular? Do you think that she sold the part?
Uh, yeah, I didn't honestly really have a good understanding of like the structure of the hierarchy of how the X-Men really worked. I never even really looked at them as like having a fine leader. I don't think that's something that the movies do a great job of like really orchestrating, but maybe they're not
Yeah.
trying to. I don't know, because I wouldn't have been able to tell you that Cyclops was the leader or that
Right.
Storm was some other sort of like leading figure. I honestly kind of look at them all as equals.
Yeah.
Halle Berry is great. I honestly haven't like really seen that many like Halle Berry
movies.
performances. I don't think it was great to see her in what would have definitely been her heyday. I honestly wasn't even thinking about her Oscars when her Oscar went for Monsters Ball and how close in proximity it would have been
Yeah.
to this. But that makes a lot of sense now. I thought she was great when she's on the screen. Again, she doesn't give off like a leading kind of performance to me. Like
Yeah.
just back to your point a bit. She's gorgeous in that role. She looks awesome. She rocks that white hair. Something good
Yeah.
too, I'll say.
Yeah.
She's I loved her when she's on screen though. One thing that Joe Blow video did, and it's cool, like back to this jet scene, is I guess so she had a big issue with like becoming motion sick from all the cable work of like in the first movie. So that jet scene in hindsight is definitely a cool display of her using her powers without her having to be, on the cables and whatnot, flying through the air, getting sick. So I thought that was a cool compromise. But that jet scene is pretty cool. And even again for 2000s CGI fake weather storm, like I'd say it was still holds up 20 years later as being pretty good.
Yeah, it's funny too. I remember this vividly when we saw it in theaters. There, when he says like, "Do we have any weapons in this heap?" and then her eyes just go white. There was one dude that was like, "Fuck yeah!" Like she's like, like just got all like excited. She's about to do something, something cool. Because she didn't really have a lot to do in the first one. She does have two scenes in the first one where she does get to display her powers really well, and it's a fun little action sequence.
Okay.
But she played backseat like the rest of them compared to like Rogue and Logan. But in this, I think because the movie's longer and there's a lot more you can do with them separately and stuff, they give her a bit more to do. Give her more to do with Jean too. I'm glad that like her and Jean go off on that thing to go find Nightcrawler together, because like you need to show that like the X-Men are a team and they are friends. Like they just don't like, they're not just saddled together. Like a lot of them, they've been there since they were kids themselves and grew up in that school. So it was good to kind of see her in scenes with other people that are a part of the team that weren't just like and compared to like, I think once she's appeared in, I think this is the best use of her as a character, because they even give her some nice moments, like that whole interaction she has with Nightcrawler about the dialogue when he's basically like, how does someone so beautiful have so much anger, and she, sometimes anger can help you survive, and he like, so does Faith. Like they have this interaction where you can tell that like, even though she probably believes in the same ideologies as like Professor X, that like she's angry at seeing like what certain humans are trying to do their kind too. Like there's like a lot of anger there. So like I think little, like, again, the movie's full of little scenes like that don't really have like a lot of, maybe shouldn't have a ton of weight, but they do, because they just are just these short little moments where the writing's really good and like the actors really sell the meaning behind those scenes. I thought was really good.
Right. There, it is littered with a lot of scenes that are big for certain characters, but overall in the context of the movie don't have a lot of weight, but they do for a certain character at a certain time. It's just like minuscule in scale, but huge in weight for that particular character. Like that moment with her and Nightcrawler at the church when they first find him.
No, so they have a talk there too, and then there's a talk on the jet when they're, I guess, on their way to go get Logan and everyone. Yeah,
right.
And they have that whole like interaction with each other. I thought that was like a really good little moment between those two.
I was just remembering that scene when Logan's at the fridge when Bobby's parents walk in the house and he's sitting there like looking at them and they're looking at him and it's like, where the kid's at? Like someone needs to do some explaining. Like, that scene actually cracked me up.
I love when like when the parents walk in and Bobby runs downstairs and he's like, "This is Professor Logan," and Logan looks at him like, "What?" Like that's the excuse you're gonna give them. Like that's what you're gonna tell them. And then he's like, "What are you a professor of?" And he's just like, "Art." That's a really. It's a really serious scene too, but like funny all in the same moment. Like
Definitely.
really handled really well. And then of course that whole jet scene ends where Mito actually saves them.
Saves.
And we get the whole explanation as to how Stryker got hold of Cerebro. That was his fault, but not really.
Right.
And also, there's some just fun like interactions. Oh, a cool moment on the jet when they actually missile explodes above it, and then Rogue gets sucked out. That was another cool teleport scene for Nightcrawler when he goes to save her. And it's just like a quick. And I remember like everyone applauded during that too. It's just like this like it's super. All you can hear is like the wind and her like kind of screaming, and then like that whole initial like whatever the noise it makes when he teleports and he grabs her, and then like they roll back on the jet. It's so that's a cool little.
That was a slick little rescue scene, and
I don't know why
something else to do.
Yeah, I don't know why she was freaking out trying to put on her seatbelt. Everyone else was okay.
Yeah,
but she couldn't get hers on.
No.
But yeah, I love the kind of like you said, Magneto's a really interesting character because there's a lot of sense of humor and like the stuff that he is like when he's trying to tell them about what's going on, and he was like basically like Logan, like you have a connection to him, and he's like, well, the professor already sent me there, and he's like, well, the professor trusts you to figure this out on your own. He's like, I don't have as much faith in you as he does, basically implying that he's not smart enough to figure things out on his own.
Right.
And oh yeah, so did the Mystique, because that happens and during that sequence where they're kind of camped out, when Mystique goes into Logan's tent pretending to be Jean. Were you aware of how that connected to like the first movie? Because he's the one that like stabs her in the first, and Mystique in the first movie after their big fight.
That I did not know.
Oh yeah, so I was like wondering what that scene would be like for you. Were you just like, was Mystique just horny or like just that
I didn't really clue in. I can't remember. Does she say anything to him? She must, because she transforms back to Mystique while she's on top of him, doesn't she?
Yeah, she's like,
but I can't remember the dialogue.
Yeah, she basically said like nobody has like, she said stab me the way that you did or something like that along those lines, and then like and he's like what do you want? And she turns into like Storm, and then and then when he pushes her off, and he turns into Stryker, like, well, what do you really want? Like basically implying that you want answers. But yeah, I thought that was like a little fun moment for them, but I was like, out of context, would you even know what that scene was about?
No, I did not really know what was going on. I just chalked it up to like Mystique. It was definitely a chance for Mystique to like fuck around with Logan, but another cool display of like her abilities and her powers, I guess, is kind of how I chalked it up.
Yeah,
wasn't really sure because again, I had no insight as to what happened between them in the first movie, so that makes a lot of sense now. I wish I remembered exactly what she'd said to him, but
then like
that's pretty neat.
And then I guess we get more of like Jean and Logan, and they're kind of they have a connection. They have a really small scene too, where she's like basically saying that she likes Scott because he's a good guy, and she wanted to be with like the good guy because she's like, because the bad boy, isn't always around. They leave, implying that after the first movie, Logan left, like he didn't stay. I think they do again, like really small moments between them. They have decent chemistry together. I think where you can tell there's I buy it,
budding romance.
Yeah. But not too jammed down your throat, but just enough to be like, all right, she definitely is attracted to him, but she also knows that she has like a good dude that she's with and doesn't want to mess that up. But that plays out in the comic books too. They have like there's like a flirtatious thing between those two characters because she is more in line to be more like Scott, like that character. But I think she's attracted to Logan because he's so far removed from who Scott is. So yeah, but I think they do a good job selling it, even though they don't really have a ton of scenes to kind of build that up. I bought it. It's not right. It just makes me feel even more like bad for him that he's not in any parts of this movie when all this stuff is going 100%. On.
Yeah, exactly. He's largely absent while his girls, kind of like get closer to Logan. It's like, damn, man.
And then they have that whole plan to like kind of get in the facility so they can try to like stop them from using Cerebro to kill all the mutants and stuff. And again, another snarky moment from Magneto when like Logan's like, I'll go in. And he's like, when someone gets in there, they're going to know how to control the mechanism. He's like, what are you going to do? Scratch it with your claws?
That's right. Yeah. Because I think it's better for Mystique to go in there, which is a great decision.
I think it's just because Ian McKellen being British. There's certain line deliveries that come off really well when you
No,
have like
100%.
such highbrow, high class attached
And
to you.
it just like fits so well with like just him as a person that I think that is really fit into like why I really liked Magneto as much as I really did. Like he is so dry and slick and like just has his delivery, like you said, and like the accent that he has naturally. Just I don't know, he's very good at like definitely picking on Logan, but not coming across as malicious.
Yeah,
He kind of is disguised like in his like in the way that he like picks on Logan. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah, I really
And
appreciated his humor throughout.
I did too. It was like he brought like much needed, he brought much needed levity without ever feeling like he was less of a threat though. Like that he is still a threat.
That's a great way
Like
of putting it.
he's like still a viable threat, but like they were able to use kind of like his kind of dry kind of sense of humor to
Right.
great effect in during a few moments.
So he's not so serious all the time. That
Right.
would have gotten old probably.
And like you said, a good choice to have Mystique do it because it was a short little action sequence, but the way it ends, where she just slides underneath the door and then flips him off,
Yeah,
on her way in, it's like a really fun thing to do, and just a really fun character. She gets a lot of cool moments to shine like that.
she really does. She is prior to watching, didn't really realize how much of like that Mystique even really kind of was on Magneto's side. That she was very much his like henchwoman
Yeah,
dynamic. Because like seeing most of my like experience with Mystique would have been of like seeing a little bit of Jennifer Lawrence here and there, and I just wouldn't have expected her to be cast in a role that's like sort of antagonistic. So I just didn't have an impression that she was like not with like the main cast. So moments where she's kind of like doing Magneto's bidding, she really shines, and I thought it was like honestly really interesting way.
Fiercely loyal without saying much, man. Like you can tell that she rides hard for him.
Yeah,
like and he rides hard for her too. I think.
Yeah.
I think that's until you get to that third movie. There's a scene that happens that I hate, but like by the time, yeah, it's very out of character. I mean, I guess it's not out of character for him, but after seeing how cool they are together, it sucks that movie chose to like kind of dismantle that a little bit.
Okay,
because they really, like he's more of the henchman figure in the first one. They don't have a ton that they're doing together, but in this one, like having them like side by side, my dog, that kind of thing, you kind of see it, how they perform it and portray it. So I thought that was really cool. And then I guess I loved how they set up the sequence of like Stryker using Xavier to use Cerebro to kill all the mutants, and how they kind of showed Cerebro like basically like identifying where all of them are at, and I thought that was really pretty well done, and I love that they indicate too that like if Magneto has his helmet on, like no one can get inside of his head, which is why he's the only one that can actually go in there and not be affected by what Jason's trying to do through Xavier. I also thought it was cool when it doesn't attack the mutants and they're all like kind of reacting to it in different ways. With Mystique, how it has her like basically going in and out of being like blue, and then you see basically some of the people she's turned into throughout the movie. I thought that was really cool. But I also, again, to kind of point out how villainous Magneto is, it's not about saving Xavier moment at all. It's like, all right, well, I'm just gonna undo what Stryker tried to do and reverse it.
And use it to kill.
And I'm sorry.
Opportunity.
But it just shows how, like, again, there seems to be respect. The way he says goodbye to him, he's like, goodbye, Charles. He just kind of taps his chair. Like, there is respect there, but it's like, I got to do what I got to do.
Yeah.
To make sure that they don't kill us. And that's the way that's how he looks at it. Very interesting.
Like any good villain, they make his motivations like a way that you can kind of stomach them or like sympathize with his point of view. Yeah. And definitely one of the better examples of like in a way that I think like best done after him, like with Thanos, you know what I mean? Where you really, even though you don't have to agree with how he approaches things, you very much buy into why he thinks this way and why he's out to do what he's out to do. That's just another one of the many aspects of how they portrayed Magneto that I just really bought into his character. I really believed. And like, no, I see a lot of this in X2. I was very much aware that was a Holocaust survivor and he witnessed all these atrocities as a kid. And that's actually
the opening of the first movie too. They show that a bit.
In the first movie, that sequence I remember.
Yeah, you see him as a kid. Yeah.
And so like very much like better way to plant the seed of hatred for humanity in a villainous character. Like you totally are on board. How could you not sympathize with him in that from
Yeah,
his experiences there?
very
So
true.
I thought those carry very much over to the second movie in a very compelling
Great
way.
way. Yeah, I agree. Oh, and by the way, by this point, James Marsden's has
Yeah,
re-entered
yeah, there
the
you go.
has
Yeah.
re-entered the
I'm
movie.
back, baby.
First, he tries to kill his love because he's under control of Stryker, and then, like I said, she full on like flings him across the room with her powers.
Yeah.
Because
And
she,
Magneto has another great line with him and Mystique are kind of like, I think what they're kind of knocked onto the ground from like an explosion from within the dam. Or
oh
no,
yeah,
it's from, I think it's
oh,
probably
it's
from the fight.
from the fight, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, yeah, this is one lover's quarrel we don't want to be in the middle of.
Oh, that's true, because like she senses him coming. I forgot about that. She senses him coming in her mind, and she pushes them down with her powers to get them out of the way of the blast. And then like, yeah, he just gets up like, this is one lover's quarrel we don't want to get involved. Yeah.
Yeah, that line had me laugh out loud.
Yeah, and then it's cool that he's back in the movie. Again, you're right. He doesn't really, even though I know just from the comic books that he is facto leader of the team, he doesn't really feel like he is, because
you don't see him exhibit that in the second movie at all.
Not really, and like it's because he just doesn't have a lot to do. Like like
show up and get beat up.
You just beat up, and then like you said, by two women in the movie. Nothing against that. I mean, Jean Grey's pretty powerful, and as we see later, Deathstrike, Kelly Hu, who hasn't done much the entire movie, gets a pretty big action sequence with Wolverine.
Yes.
I'm sure it was the bulk of her filming that movie was just training for that.
Probably.
It's a really well done fight, though. I mean, I know like it's early 2000s kind of fight choreography a little bit.
Falls victim to that editing and the choreography style a little bit again, but
there's a lot. You can tell there's some wire work and a lot of like there's a lot of that. The first movie has a ton of wire work. If you want to see a movie that is heavily influenced by like The Matrix, that movie
that makes total sense. Yes, I wouldn't even thought about that.
Heavily like tell like, oh, like this is the new thing. Like we're gonna use this in all our action sequences now. But there's certain moments where I kind of wince where because her claws are just out of her fingers, they're long, where she's like jabbing him in the back multiple times.
She slices him up good.
And I love this thing where you feel like he thinks that he killed her when he like stabs her in the side, and it looks like she like is gonna like basically pass out, and then she looks up at him and her face just heals, and he realizes like, oh shit, like she's same like me. As me. Pretty cool fights. That character is much more important in the comic books. Her and Logan have a pretty big connection in the comic book. Again, it's one of those things like you're using a character for the name recognition only, and not really because you want to, she's like, if you listen to the beginning of the episode and I rattled off how many people are in the movie, it's easy for someone to get lost in the shuffle, and Kelly Hu is one of them.
It's gotta be somebody.
She looks great. She sells the part well for what she has to do. I actually believed her in that fight scene. I thought she honestly killed it in that whole sequence with him. And honestly, I couldn't really tell if there were a ton of stunt people. Like there was a lot of shots of them close up where you actually saw them really engaged in fighting, which I thought was pretty cool for 2003. Pretty cool fucking fight sequence, I thought.
Yeah, be interested to know. Yeah, no, it definitely was.
And evenly matched too.
Very much so. Yeah, you get a long drawn out fight between them where other sequences may have like earlier, like her one with Cyclops. Like they get a couple blows against each other, but then like she quickly defeats him. So it was nice to see her really get to flex her chops against Wolverine, and kind of cool for him to have somewhat of a counterpart in terms of like the adamantium abilities. Like that was cool to see, and how he dispatches her was quite cool as well. I don't know what exactly does he like inject into her.
It looks like it's the adamantium stuff. I think it's just like it's not. Yeah, I think that is what he puts into her, but it's like not like a concentrated.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that's what it was.
Yeah, and I also think that scene actually works really well too, because her eyes go back to normal, and you realize that she probably wasn't evil either. Like she was under his control, and I think, and because he in that moment too, he kind of sees it a little bit. I thought that was like a cool little moment for like the audience. You're like, oh, like she probably didn't want to be doing this at all whatsoever, but under someone else's control. So
that's right. That. I honestly didn't really clue into that at the time, actually, either. Now that you mentioned that, it's exactly what happens. Yeah. And then but like there's something about her
that comes off her eye.
Bottom, sinking. And then
it's unintentional. Like remember, I chuckled in the theater, and a few people did too when she hits the bottom. And it just goes skunk because she's like metal.
Yeah.
Like,
it's kind of humorous, but in my head, it was kind of disturbing, like that to be filled up with this like metal liquid and it's solidifying inside you. Like that's got to be, ugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was very impactful. But no, when the Clink hit, it definitely sent that point across.
Yeah. And then Stryker, I mean, last few moments for Stryker, he just goes through it. Like, between being stabbed by Wolverine, who catches up to him quickly? I thought Stryker had a bit of distance ahead of them, especially since like the mutants almost died in that whole sequence. But like, yeah, I love when like he's basically like not listening to him anymore, and he basically tells him like, okay, like if we die, you die, and he just like straps him to like the helicopter. Is like because that flood's coming from the dam. He's like, if we're gonna go, like you're gonna go too. That was like a cool final point because he easily could have been like, tell me more about my past, all this stuff, and he's like not listening to it anymore. And then if that wasn't bad enough, when Magneto comes upon Stryker, like he just like basically squeeze him, and like the last time we see Stryker, he's like all chained up on the wall, like completely wrapped up in chains. It looks like Magneto just like stuck him there. It is crazy to see someone that was such a big kind of villain, like he was like getting away with a lot. He's reduced to like nothing in those last like moments that we see him. He's not.
That's right. He's very much left. No, he's not. Exactly. He's very much left in a non-threatening position. He's very much exposed, chained to the open with no power to do anything. It's like all his ability and power and intimidation from earlier in the movie is stripped away from him, and he's left there pretty much powerless. And I can only assume, I don't think it shows him die, but you can only assume that he must.
Oh yeah, well it doesn't. Right? It doesn't. It shows like him hearing like. It doesn't show him die, but it shows him hearing the water like from the flood coming, and that he's gonna be like completely submerged in that. So yeah, he's not making it. He's not making it.
That's a shitty way to go.
Oh, that's the most emotional part of the movie. I don't want to take you back a little bit to when I first saw it.
Yes, please do.
Because they've been building the whole movie that they're alluding to the whole Phoenix thing the entire movie, Jean, and how she can't control her powers.
Which you're very much aware of. You're picking up on the stuff that's coming, right? Because it's a very big part of the comics, right?
Right. But in the comic book, the way she becomes it is different. Like they go on like the space expedition, and like while they're there, like Dark Phoenix does a decent job of like interpreting that scene.
Yeah. But I remember the trailer.
But it enters into her while she's trying to save the other X-Men and the crew from this like shuttle that they're trying to like rescue. And when it enters her, like she starts as, like I mentioned it before, like Phoenix is a good person in the beginning. Like when she becomes the Phoenix, it is this all-powerful being, but she uses her powers to like save different parts of the universe, and like she's still an X-Men. It's like eventually later on down the line, the power becomes so strong that she's consumed by it, and then she becomes evil.
Right.
So I knew that there seems like they're going that direction. Like they're trying to like. I mean, granted, like they're showing like flames in her eyes from the effects and stuff. So like they're trying to talk about the Phoenix stuff. And then we get to this. Then we get to the scene in the jet where they can't get the jet to like start. And even 20 years ago, I was like, all right, they could play on the whole. It's not a space shuttle thing anymore, but there might be some kind of moment of sacrifice here that might allow that to happen. And it didn't happen the way that I really thought it was going to happen. But I got the impression that they're going to sacrifice, like she was going to die, essentially. I remember building up to that. My friend was sitting next to me, and he was just like, are they going to kill her off? They're killing her off. I mean, well, like trying to whisper, like, they're not really killing her off. It's the whole like Phoenix thing, I think. They're like, but dude, like we got through this whole movie, and like they're about to get away. Are they really going to kill her off? I was like, I don't know. Just watch the movie. So when she gets off the
right,
I remember just like a whole theater, you could just feel just kind of like, oh, that is what's going to happen.
How they're going about it.
That's what they're going to happen here. And it's a cool scene for her, a cool display of like her powers and what she's willing to do to help her friends. I do love that they actually, you know what, probably the best stuff that James Marsden has in the entire movie, when he's trying to get them to lower the ramp, and like she's basically shut it all herself, and she's not letting them off because she's trying to save them.
Right.
He's actually really good in that scene. Again, makes me wish he had more to do.
Him and Hugh Jackman both, they're on very much different ends of the spectrum in terms of like showing their grief. They both get the same point across.
Yeah, and I like that since she's a telepathic, she uses Xavier to say what she needs to say about like how this is the only way. There's no other way for them to get out. So she basically has to sacrifice herself so they can all. And you know what? Any other actors having Hugh Jackman do that dialogue with Patrick Stewart, but he's supposed to be talking as if he's Gene. Might have been silly if it would have been lesser actors, but like it actually, and then like and having him talk to Scott too, when he's like saying like, "Please don't do this." Like they all played it really well. I thought it was a really
So definitely one
emotional,
of the more impactful moments of the scene or of the movie.
yeah, like really
100%.
well done emotional moment, and like yeah, I was like, what did you think about all that?
Well, here's the thing. So I naturally had a little bit of a different. I couldn't fully buy into her sacrifice, which is like very disappointed about because I just know that she's in the next movie. I couldn't pretend that she wasn't. So like that, I honestly, well, on the other hand, though, I didn't know that X2 would end with her sacrificing herself. So I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. But like, I couldn't fully buy into her sacrifice. I know that she doesn't actually die.
Right.
However, I still don't know how they bring her into X3. So like, I'm interested to see how that goes.
Right.
It was still a very much impactful moment. I took away the most from that scene was in Scott and Logan's reaction. Like that was the highlight of that scene for me. But it was definitely really well done. You felt her sacrifice. I just couldn't get over the fact that I just knew that she wasn't really gone.
Really gone, yeah.
I can imagine like the theater watching it, like that would have been a really emotional scene to have seen and think that
also
she's
really
actually gone.
Ballsy move to take out a main character like that. I mean, there's I guess there's no really precedent for comic book movies then where like, oh, will they do that? Will they actually like sacrifice one of the leads, like someone that you really know? Like everyone's familiar with Jean Grey at this point. Like they've established who she is. I thought it was a pretty ballsy move to end it on that note because, for the most part, the X-Men have gotten through this entire movie. They've able to get out of these situations, relatively unscathed, and then this was the one time that they couldn't. I have a friend that sees the movie. I was like, well, why couldn't she just do this from inside the jet? I mean, whatever. I mean, she has to.
Because
the plot has to happen, and it has to be a more grandiose act of sacrifice.
What fun is your movie if everyone's safe, right? Like somebody's gotta show you're that you're capable of.
I agree, and I agree with you too on the two ends of the spectrum where Logan's is more low key, where he's like she's gone, but you can feel it when he says it, and then James Marsden is more like highly emotional, and then he has to basically hold Scott to like calm him down. I thought
kind of like denying it,
yeah. And he like because he was like when he says she's gone, he's like screaming like don't say that, and they're like these two people who don't really like each other in that moment are like bonded over their shared grief over this one person. I thought I agree with you. I think that scene works as well because of those
very
two.
Much so.
I do feel you when you know that like oh well I know she's in the third one, so it's not like she's dead, but
but
imagine seeing X2 in 2003 and you're like oh
exactly that's. I was trying to put myself in that position, but it's so crazy.
They let Halle Berry shed some like Oscar-winning tears for a second in the scene. Like, everyone has like a decent reaction shot and like like responding to it. They have Nightcrawler just doing the prayer, and I thought that was like really interesting way to end that scene. And then watching the jet kind of like float away while they're all looking down, or I think it's mostly like Storm and maybe a couple other people that are looking down, like almost like in disbelief, like she's really gone. Like you could tell that they're just like. She's not coming back from that. I thought it was like handled really well for like a big summer comic book movie, and really well handled by all the actors involved. And Famke Janssen too. I know I've heard her a lot of credit for keeping that character her own because like I said, like when she first got cast in that first movie, I was like I don't really see it. I don't really see her as Jean Grey, but like by the time you get to that second one, it seems like she's fully like has a full grasp on who that character is. And the fact that they give her more of an arc and more to do, she really handles that pretty well. I thought, no, she was really good.
Yeah, no, she's great. I'm like being fresh off the watch for X2. Like I have this compelling feeling to watch X3, but I kind of want you to prepare me a little bit for like what to expect because I know it's been critically lambasted for years. It's like everyone pretty much unequivocally agrees it's shit. But like, what is it like? What should I expect?
So
it's bad.
Here's
different director.
Different director. So it's Brett Ratner, the guy who directed Rush Hour 2, Rush Hour 3. Also directed he directed Red Dragon, and I think that movie is just mostly good because of the cast, not necessarily because Brett Ratner is a master auteur.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you. I love Red Dragon, but
I love Red Dragon too. I think Red Dragon's
source material is a big.
I think the source material is so good, and like the cast is so good in Red Dragon that I don't think any director could have entirely screwed that up. And then I also think there's a little issue with like studio interference. Like I said, they rushed it. They wanted to really get the third one out there after the second one did so well. I'll start with some good. There's some good individual scenes. There's a scene where Xavier and Magneto go to Jean's childhood home where he's now back and she's clearly not right. She's clearly like
Oh,
in
okay.
between being good and being evil. They're trying to like Xavier and Magneto are trying to both to her, but for different reasons. Like he's trying to compel her not to do this, and Magneto's trying to compel her to
Right.
embrace it and like be like who she was meant to be. And it's a really great scene between the
Okay.
three of them. And it's frustrating because the rest of the movie isn't a lot of that. It's much just
Okay.
like jammed into it. Like you have that as a plot point. You have this whole like mutant cure as another plot point. They introduce a bunch of other X-Men characters that are just there, so you can just say like, "Oh, Juggernaut's in it." Like doesn't really have a lot to do. Like, oh,
Okay.
like Ellen Page. Like, oh, there's Shadowcat. Okay, cool. Pyro is now fully on the other team now, so he's evil. But but that doesn't even pay off the way it probably should. The way it would pay off in this movie, where it feels a little bit more poetic in the sense of like, oh, this could lead to something much bigger. Having him go up against like the people that he lived with and grew up with doesn't really
Right.
pay off. Doesn't pay off
Okay. That's
the way it should have. The Dark Phoenix doesn't pay off the way it should. Like Paige Jensen barely has any lines. She just there. She stands around a lot and like uses her powers a lot. But
Okay.
they kind of almost try to make her a blank slate that she's so like not herself that they don't really give her a lot of emotion and stuff to work with. She does the
That's
best
kind
she
of
can, but
yeah.
like
That sounds in line with what I remember from like that big final sequence where I know what happens with like what Logan does to her and stuff. And
yeah,
yeah, I can't really remember her shouting too much dialogue from what I recall. So yeah,
yeah.
that's interesting choice.
She kills Scott, just because
Right.
why give
Why
James Martin?
not?
I think at this point though he was filming Superman Returns. He's in that. Bryan Singer
Oh,
also directed. So I
okay.
think in the case of that movie, he didn't have a lot of time to film. But I mean, it's par with how they treated him the entire time he's been in the franchise.
Okay. Great.
I think X3 is frustrating because there's so much left in X2 that you could have really worked with and that could have really worked in the third movie, and they don't really utilize any of it. So by the
Yeah.
time that X2 was over when I first saw it, I was like, we were always talking about like, oh, there's so much potential for the third one. Like they can do this and they can
How
do that. Like,
disappointing that must have
and
been.
to get that little over 90-minute garbage that we got like a few years later.
How many? Yeah, was it 2005, 2006?
Yeah, 2005 or six, one of those. I think 2005.
Yeah,
It's
just a
just
little quicker.
it's just not good, and it's disappointing because this one is so good.
Yeah.
And I how it like ends too, where they all go to like the president, and now
Mm.
they're all in their X uniforms, including the kids. Like they're like you saved us initially. They because Rogue actually flew the jet down to like pick them up when like towards the end of the movie. So now they're
Right.
like all a part of the team now. And I like how it sets up this like understanding like we can coexist in a way.
Mhm.
We're not all awful, but keep in
Right.
mind if you continue to mistreat us, like we'll be watching you. Like we want to see like what changes you're going to be making. I think it's a really well done like another excuse for Storm to like use her powers like darken the room and like
Yeah,
lightning and like it's all that stuff too.
totally.
Uh, but yeah, like overall, like once it was over for you, like how did you feel like once it ended? I mean, like is it something like in the pantheon of like comic book movies? Just knowing like what you know now too, like I mean for me is like as a sequel it does its job because it's bigger, it's bolder.
Right.
There's more character development. The screenplay is a lot tighter than the first movie is. Yes, there are a lot of characters. I know. I want to ask you too. Is that a detriment you think because there's so many characters in the movie? That has always been a complaint about a lot of the X-Men movies is that there's
Right.
too many people and not enough time to develop all of them.
While I agree that is an issue, I don't think it's necessarily an issue that I would like take points away from the movie. I think it's largely, I mean, it's an adaptation from a comic. It
Yeah.
has to fit these characters in there somehow. It's not necessarily the movie's fault. And it's like, props to them for where they include these characters and for even giving them the amount of time that they do. Obviously, you get some more than others. I don't necessarily think it's like the movie's fault. Plus, you got it's bookended by two other movies that you are introduced but to some other characters
Right.
and they're fleshed out a little bit more in ways that I wouldn't have had to experience yet. Oh, that sense, I had a kind of an unconventional viewing experience with this one, so it didn't really bother me. Granted, I'm also not a huge I'm not a X-Men comic book fan, so if I was, that
Right.
maybe I'd have a different opinion. I can see why comic book fans who are very much protective of the material or who wanted to see more from certain X-Men characters,
Right.
if they weren't awarded that, I can totally sympathize with why they might think this movie struggles with juggling characters. But for me, who's just a casual viewer of the X-Men or just superhero movies in general, didn't really
Right.
bother me, to tell you the truth. But your point, to answer your question about the broader pantheon of superhero movies, I'd say it fit in there real nice. It was better than probably anything I've seen from Marvel post Endgame. Didn't quite reach the heights of maybe like some of the mid 2000s, like prime MCU movies, just grant from a lot of different variables in terms of like just filmmaking evolution since the early 2000s. There's some things that I would appreciate from like the Russo movies, for instance. But for a lot of aspects of X2, the writing, the complete lack of any sort of um, agenda pushing or any sort of like social commentary that is completely just not like there is, but not in a way that it's like it's just way more intelligently written, I think, and
Right.
just not in any sort of way forceful. I really that like just looking in hindsight compared to like what we've had in the last few years, like just goes so far for me. I really appreciated that there's not you're not really like sort of coerced to really feel a certain way for any character. You would just naturally feel about what you feel
Right.
about them because of how they were written, and it just is very intelligently done.
Right.
I'd say like, was it my there's mountains and mountains of movies, superhero movies in general that I not like nearly as much as I liked X2. I'd say I'd like comfortably put it up there in like near top second tier like superhero movies, I guess is where I'd lay it.
Yes.
I would have loved to have seen it in the earlier days and like been able to resonate with it a little bit more. But unfortunately, just because of circumstances, I wasn't able to. But this will absolutely be a series that I will probably continue to watch and like revisit in the past. I'll definitely
Yeah.
like pair it with X1 next time I watch it. I wouldn't recommend anybody that just jump in to any sequel movie and not have any familiarity with the first.
Right.
But as much as I'm like expecting like a bad watch for X3, I at least feel like I want to watch it to see where these characters go. So points to
Right.
the movie for making me care about these characters. Did a lot of things right, and I think modern day superhero movies could learn a lot from this basic formula, and what works from this era of Marvel movies in general was just
Yeah.
leagues better than what we've been getting. And so it'd be nice to see maybe some future filmmakers look back to the roots and learn from movies like X2 because it just did so many things right.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that again because it is a simpler time for like comic book movies, right?
Yes,
It's just you're just making like even though this is a sequel, I think there's aspects of it that can stand alone where you're like, okay, I can maybe go like there's a few character things that you need to pick up on, but it feels
yeah,
like it's its own self-contained story. So
for
like
sure.
so there's that, and like I'm glad you say that because I got that same feeling rewatching it where it's like this is so much I miss this a bit where
That's how I felt.
it's not tied to something else. The only real
Yep,
connection I really need is like, okay, I saw that first movie and like I know who these people are.
yep,
At this point, now I care about them because I've had exposure to them already. But
yep,
again, the movie itself isn't pushing like you know a connection to something else. Like yeah, like I said, there are plot threads that are left open for a future movie, but it's a future
totally.
movie within this space and not like tying it to like Fantastic
A
Four or
grand,
something else,
yeah,
a grander scale event. You know,
yes.
so I'm glad that the movie can feel big without having to be big
It's
like
just the
that.
right size. It's the perfect
Right.
size. It's like Goldilocks, you know what I mean? Like it's
Right.
not
Yeah.
too small scale like the first one probably is, which is still a good intro, no doubt. It just did exactly what a good sequel needs to do. It expanded upon the first movie, introduced a little bit more things, assuming was accompanied by a bigger budget, which allowed them to do a little bit more stunt work, just flesh out a few more characters, add a few more people to the plot. All these notes just do well.
Yeah. B Web, when the film turned 15, actually wrote an article that it said that X2, uh, X-Men United is still one of the best superhero movies 15 years later. And here's why, a little bit why they thought is, uh, said X2 as was released in 2003. There was 3 years after its predecessor and just a year after Sony's first live-action Spider-Man truly blew the door wide open for modern superhero movies. As good as those movies still are, there was and still is something truly special about X2. This is a deeper movie, a bolder movie, a movie that isn't afraid to be dark, yet can still throw in some necessary humor and compassion in order to avoid being a needlessly bleak affair. The movie shows how to
Mhm.
balance a great many characters, yet give them all, or at least most of them, a satisfying arc without a massive amount of dedicated screen time. There is an early template at play here that Marvel Studios and other successful superhero movies would later use, and in the case of the MCU, arguably perfect. So I think that's a good way to describe. I mean, for the time period when it came out in 2003, I think think because of the progression, because you had Blade, and that was a good start. And then X-Men was the
Yes.
other good start in 2000. And then Spider-Man kind of blew it all open. We're like, oh, this is like even bigger, you know, continuation
Yes.
of like what they're. And then when you get to X3, and it's being better than X1 was really, really needed to do. Like, it just needs to
Yep.
be a better movie than that first movie. And so it was a good little streak of continuing, like, oh, like this is what you can do with this world, all these characters, in a really good way if you have a director and some good writers, even though said director was very problematic while making it out later. But
Right.
yeah, it really is, I think, why I still consider it one of the best comic movies ever. That I mean, I hold it in a pretty high regard because I just think it does what it's
As you
to do
should. It
as a
it, it
sequel
should
and as a
be.
comic movie. You know, I think it doesn't sometimes get thrown in with a lot of the greats because there's so many more that have come out uh, in the 20 years that this movie
I think
was
that's the
released.
case as well. Yeah.
Because you know, I think with some lists you'll see a lot of Iron Man, you'll see a lot of The Dark Knight, you'll see a lot of even
Civil
Batman
War.
Begins. Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll see Civil War, like almost like, you know, a little forgotten, even though it was successful when it came out. It's, you know, it's just, I think it's just a matter of like just a lot of product out there,
It,
and and
naturally. And that,
yeah,
yeah. One highlight from that article that you just read from that I really wanted to comment. I don't know why I didn't address this in the first place. One of my absolute least favorite qualities of like to the modern superhero landscape, Marvel is like the biggest, like, I guess, abuser of this is like
mhm,
just unnecessary tone ruining comedy. This movie, like, while it has, like you said, like particularly with Magneto, a couple lines from Logan, it
yeah,
adds some levity with a few lines of dialogue, but they're not even necessarily like punchline jokes. It adds humor, if you will, right where it's needed, just the right amount, even like maybe less than it really could have. And I'm like, less is more in a movie like this. It doesn't sacrifice the tone at any point. It's not forced in there.
yeah.
And I'm sure you can see what I'm saying, where like very much relied upon in superhero movies these days.
I
And
think
it
so
kind
too.
of adds for a tonally inconsistent experience when you have a movie that's supposed to big, dark, bold consequences and scenes that is
Yeah.
ruined by, jokes that are thrown out mid
That
action
would
scene.
not be happening if, like, you know, an action sequence was if this was real.
Exactly.
You wouldn't like throw in a clever quip, like, you
Right.
know, like
Yeah,
right,
I can,
yeah,
I'll let it slide when it's Peter Parker who's
yeah.
17 or
The
16
movie's
and
like,
he's throwing quips. That makes sense. That's consistent with his character. But when you have this, that, and every other character throwing out liners and stuff, I really appreciated that it wasn't it's just used sparingly in this movie. So that
yeah.
I get away without acknowledging that.
I agree. I agree with that. It reminded me of one more funny Logan moment, and just it
Yeah.
on brand for his character is after he does the tornadoes to get rid of the other jets. And then, like, I think it's either her or Jean that's like, "Are you guys all right?" And like Logan just blatantly goes, "No," doesn't even like try to be like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
we're good."
Just
Like,
so
no,
gruff, and he has a funny way of like delivering his lines, like because he's such a tough, badass character. But it's
yeah,
funny that most of the humor comes from him.
yeah.
But
So, two, like we said, opened on May 2nd, 2003, and it grossed $85.6 million in its opening weekend. Uh, and overseas, it grossed 69.27 million in its first 5 days, including previews. The film exceeded Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets in terms of number of screenings. X2 would hold this record until the following year when it was taken by Shrek 2. Uh, and was the number one movie in America for 2 weeks before being displaced by The Matrix Reloaded. Oh, that'd be a fun anniversary. Uh,
oh god.
and here's the crazy thing about the summer of 2003. X2, The Matrix Reloaded, Finding Nemo, Bruce Almighty, and Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl all became the first five films to cross the $200 million mark at the box office in one summer season. It was a really
Whoa.
big summer season 20
Holy.
years ago.
That's interesting to put in perspective, isn't it?
That's crazy. Film ultimately grossed 214.9 million in the United States and Canada, and it was the sixth highest grossing film of 2003. And then it earned a total of 407.7 million worldwide, and it made 107 million dollars in its first 5 days when released on DVD. God, I can't believe I'm saying DVD. Uh, Also outgrossed its predecessor. The first movie, I think, tapped out at like 150 million dollars domestic, so it actually improved upon
Yeah, quite a bit.
the first movie, which is always what the studio wants.
Yeah,
Uh, Critical response, 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, so very fresh there. It was good.
very much fresh.
Website's consistent states tightly scripted, solidly acted, and impressively ambitious X2 X-Men United is bigger and better than its predecessor and a benchmark for comic sequels in general. Also received an A Cinema score on its opening day. And a lot of critics that did enjoy it, they praised the film for being able to handle so many characters in one film. Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars as well. The Los
Nice.
Angeles Times loved it, said it was better than its predecessor. Uh, and then he also, Los Angeles Times also said that the film carried emotional themes that are present in the world today, and commented that the acting was better than usual for a superhero film. Rolling Stone also said that it appreciated its film's tributes to outcasts, teens, gays, minorities, and other people who feel like they're outcasts. Like the movie acknowledges their existence in a very meaningful and real way. An Empire called X2 the best comic book movie of all time in 2006, while Wizard named Wizard magazine, which is a comic book magazine that you're a comic book collector, it used to tell you how much your comic books were worth and all that stuff. Named the film's ending as the 22nd greatest cliffhanger of all time. And in May 2007, Rotten Tomatoes listed X2 as the 5th greatest comic book film of all time.
Crazy. Okay. A lot of high praise upon release for this movie. That's honestly awesome to hear.
So I'm not the only one.
No, there's definitely a case to be made. More of like a dog in this fight had I been more familiar with the movie and its impact on release and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But undeniably, it is a fantastic comic book movie, fantastic comic book sequel, one that certainly holds up 20 years later. I got to say, despite 2000s directing and editing choices aside, that's a product of the time. You got to get over that sort of thing. Nothing really detracted in this movie for me. I'm glad. I don't know if I would have come around to watch these otherwise had we not been talking about the anniversary. So I gotta say thanks for putting me on this watch. And even after our discussion today, I even hold in a little bit higher regard than I did coming right off the watch. So that's nice to be able to say as well.
That's good.
Yeah.
And talk briefly about the embattled Bryan Singer,
because I don't even really remember what happened to him,
which is kind of disappointing because, you look at situations like his. Really good filmmaker. I mean, Usual Suspects is one of my favorite movies ever. It's really well done. He directed X-Men, a hire for X-Men based on what he did with Usual Suspects. Does an even better job with X2. Doesn't return for X3 because he's doing Superman Returns. He does come back the co-writer and co-producer on X-Men First Class, and then also directed X-Men Days of Future Past, which is really good, and X-Men Apocalypse, which is not so great. He, as we know, he was in the middle of directing the Queen biopic Bohemian Rhapsody, although he was fired from the film shortly before its completion in the wake of allegations of sexual misconduct. These things have been talked about even during time that he was doing X-Men and X2. There was a known thing that he had a problem with pills and stuff, and he was taking a lot of that while making these movies. There was one incident on X2. I only know about this because I had to write the story about it. But there was a stunt on the movie with Hugh Jackman, and he wasn't prepared as a director to have him engaged in said stunt. And Hugh Jackman could have really gotten hurt. It really got hurt. So Halle Berry being, she's like, outspoken. I saw this, and was like, the funny thing about this story, and then this is the only part that's funny, is that several of the cast, led by her, marched over to Bryan Singer's trailer after this whole thing happened in full X-Men costumes because they were still filming. So they're marching over, and they're in their leather black outfits to call him out, what's wrong with you, get it together. They're filming, I think they filmed X2 in parts of Canada, so it was really, really cold when they were filming the movie. They said dire temperatures while they were filming a lot of stuff.
That's
and a lot of
it was over here. Yeah.
And a lot of it was at night. So they had a ton of night shoots, and it wasn't the best environment, but it would have been made better if they had a leader who was on top of everything. And just knowing what they all went through while making it, and that the movie turned out as good as it did, despite the fact that he was probably a mess while making it, I guess is a testament of really good team, not just him, just editors, actors who are shit together.
It's funny how often a great movie has such a troubled production, or you hear stories about the production afterwards, and though it's a pretty well regarded, excellent movie, it's uncanny how many of those movies have production history or production trouble.
Here's the funny story too that was magazine. So they interviewed Alan Cumming in 2021, and it says Halle Berry and Bryan Singer once engaged in a tense exchange on the set of X2, X-Men United, according to Alan Cumming. It says, in an expert from his upcoming memoir, Baggage Tales from a Fully Packed Life, obtained by Page Six, X2 star Alan Cumming recounts the moment when Barry told Singer to kiss my black ass. The moment was
Wow.
preceded by an intervention staged by the X2 cast, who confronted Singer about his behavior on set, claims Cumming. Singer has himself admitted he was using painkillers at the time. He writes in his memoir. So Cumming was joined by Barry and their X2 co-stars, including Patrick Stewart, Hugh Jackman, and James Marsden, and Famke Janssen, as the group of actors attempted to raise their concerns with Singer. Barry specifically spoke movingly of people she had known with drug issues, Cumming writes. After a pause, Singer allegedly told the group, "You people are full of shit." Cumming writes that Singer told him and his co-stars that none of us had ever made a decent film and that the actors were lucky to be working with him.
Oh my God.
In response, Barry said, "I've heard enough," and left the trailer where the intervention was taking place, according to Cumming. As she walked away, she said, "You can kiss my black ass," Cumming recalls in his book. It's a great story.
That's funny, like coming off her Oscar win, right? All this movie is being shot and him saying that about them, like that is crazy.
Yeah, and to kind of corroborate some of this too, it says that production on X2 was put on pause following the intervention, and after plenty of back and forth between 20th Century Fox and lawyers, the cast was urged to muddle through their remaining work on the film. Hollywood Reporter also detailed the same alleged incident, noting that X2 executive producer Tom DeSanto attempted to halt shooting when he learned that Singer was incapacitated after taking a narcotic. DeSanto was allegedly concerned about safety on set after learning that some crew members had also taken the drug, but Singer continued to shoot and Jackman was injured on set. Here we go. After which the cast staged their intervention. Uh, yeah. And Barry did talk about this in 2020. Said the director was not the easiest to work with. And she said, "I mean, everybody's heard the stories. I don't have to repeat them, and heard of his challenges and what he struggles with. I would sometimes be very angry with him. I got into a few fights with him, said a few curse words out of sheer frustration. When I work, I'm serious about that. And when that gets compromised, I get a little nutty. But at the same time, I have a lot of compassion for people who are struggling with whatever they're struggling with. And Bryan struggles." So
Honestly, that I don't have a lot of insight like to Halle Berry, like her personal life, but like that's a really well written excerpt about, or a well written piece, like I guess what she had to say there. Like that, honestly, I
yeah,
have massive respect for her. She seems like a very like level headed person and like someone who's can hold herself accountable for her own behavior. And I think
yeah.
that is a
You know,
respectable trait. Good
and at
for
the
her.
time she did this interview, like all the sexual misconduct stuff was out there about Singer. She could have
She
easily
could have trashed him easily.
trashed him
She
on
did not
that level,
do
and
that.
she did not. But I just thought that was just an interesting
Respect.
story from that
Yeah.
set.
I
And
hadn't
I
heard
just
any of this before.
to be a fly on the wall when she's like, "You can kiss my black ass," and she's like
That
walking
is
away
awesome.
and full on white hair and
Yeah.
Just
She
been
would
like
have
a
looked like
cool-
a real superhero, probably.
yeah, but like like I said, man, it's weird like to hear about these stories on movies like this that turn out so good, and you're like,
It really could have it could have like all fallen apart just before it was even completed, right? But it didn't.
yeah, I mean, but yeah, I wanted to end it on like a little behind the scene tidbit note.
Oh,
The
the
movie,
best
like,
parts. It's
so
my
that was
favorite part
kind
about chatting movies. It's all the stuff you
of
don't see.
kind of cool, and I just
Yeah.
love that Alan Cumming included it in his memoirs as well.
Yeah.
Like that was such a pivotal point in his
I
life.
can't help but feel like this has probably been one of his bigger productions, and probably a lot of good stories
Yeah,
came
and
from the
a lot
shooting
of
of
his
this movie.
things was with her too. So
Yeah.
like, yeah, so yeah, that was pretty
This
awesome.
this is speculative, but I can't help but feel that that scene where Hugh Jackman got injured or like was at risk of injuring himself in that scene where he's jumping down like from like the
I
balcony.
think
and
it might have
attacking.
been.
Yeah, and him night shoots.
Yeah,
That
I
would
think it
make
might have been.
sense.
And and I will say this: Brian Cox got some crap because he kind of defended at least Bryan Singer as a filmmaker while making X2. He said that he was under a lot of stress and it's a big
No doubt.
production,
Yeah.
and blah 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 blah. A lot of people got mad at Brian Cox for even defending him, but Brian Cox is of that age where he's like, "I don't give a fuck what you guys say. I'm gonna do what I want to do."
Yeah.
uh,
Also been around a lot longer than anybody else on that set would, besides probably Ian McKellen
McKellen, Patrick Stewart,
and
yeah.
Patrick Stewart, but he would have been among those vets that would have had some insight, as he would have been working with directors who had balanced huge studio productions and probably could sympathize with the stress that Bryan Singer was probably under. Granted, maybe he doesn't know everything about like the sexual misconduct either. I'm sure he wouldn't have been that outspoken if he had, but again,
Who knows? I
who
mean,
knows? But
they actually tried to recently ask Hugh Jackman about Bryan Singer, and Hugh Jackman gave an answer without really giving an answer, like
mm,
almost like addressing like, yes, I know there are issues, but he didn't seem like he wanted to dog the experience of making those movies, and didn't want to dog the experience of working with him. Uh,
right,
he took a more like
admirable.
diplomatic like approach to
It's
it. But
exactly what I would expect out of Hugh
yeah,
Jackman.
but I think people wanted the definitive, like, oh, like, well, was it as shitty as we thought, or like as we've heard, or
Right.
like, they wanted, gossip, and he didn't really give it to him. And then some people will that as like, well, like, what he's accused of, so why don't you give us like, there's no reason for you to defend him in any way, I guess.
Hmm.
But I always feel bad for actors when they get dragged into like having to comment on like people they used to work with. I mean, like,
That's not what they're there to do. You know what I
granted,
mean?
he made 3 X-Men movies with him. He also has a cameo, I think, in Apocalypse, so like technically 4. So I mean, yeah, it has to be a really interesting dynamic. You've worked with the guy 4 times, and
Right. Months at
it's
a time. Yeah.
once at a time. He's partly responsible for kind of your big break. I mean, like, X-Men was Hugh Jackman's first big
Hmm.
thing, made him a star. So it's complicated. I actually think Halle Berry probably has the best response to all of that.
I think so too.
Where she was
Yeah.
like, you guys know the stories. I don't gotta tell you. Like,
Exactly.
you
No
know,
sense beating a dead horse.
yeah. And you know what? It's interesting because she came back and did some stuff for Days of Future Past. So she worked with him again. I think maybe under certain conditions that she was like, I'm not gonna deal with this and this and that.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting to like learn how like people work together at one point. Like, it didn't really work out. They didn't get along, but then they worked with them multiple times, and it's like, I'm not in the actor's head. I'm also not bouncing their checkbook, so they're like, I'll be enough money. I'll work with so and so again.
Right.
But yeah, I always I look at something like X2, which is just so well, like a well-oiled machine. It's like, oh, it was not going off the rails while they were making it. Just like crazy to think about.
Yeah, I would not have guessed that it would have had that sort of production history. So, with some interesting insight uh, in like that video that I was referencing earlier when we were recording, really get into the whole backstory. So, always love finding out little tidbits of particularly troubled
Productions.
productions. Yeah, it's always interesting. I mean, it's like kind of like driving by a car crash, right? You can't help but look. You don't want it to
Yeah.
happen, but
Yeah.
it's nice. It's kind of interesting
You're
to
curious.
see. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so we always give anniversary movies a score at the end. I'll let you go first. This is
Okay.
a first time watch for you. What do you give it?
Oh, okay. I feel like this is one that's going to change, and it might not be reflective of how like objectively good the movie is. I want to go out of 5 today, switch it up a little bit, and I want to say I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5.
All right,
Which is
if we go without a 5, God, I want to give it.
You can give it a 5 if you want.
No. The only reason I won't give it a 5 because like I think the Cyclops thing is an issue. I think like
Okay, yeah.
highlighting him is like
Yeah, agreed.
I give it 4.5 though. I think
That's
it's close. I mean, like
score.
yeah,
Probably deserving.
and I think that's the only nitpicky thing I have about it. It's like
Right.
highlighting such an important character so early in the movie.
Yeah.
And not having him come back until the climax, then like
Fair
not
enough.
really do much.
Some of my points like come from like issues that aren't necessarily the movie's fault, but that would like affect my enjoyment of it, like the PG rating, some of the editing choices, just some stuff like that in no way like really like detracts from the movie, but just affects my enjoyment slightly. But hey, there's a lot of movies I would give less than a 3.5 to. Especially superhero movies. Like that's a high rating from myself. So I definitely enjoyed X2. Would recommend it to superhero Marvel lovers that haven't seen it yet, without a doubt.
All right. Well, that gets us through our 20th anniversary discussion on X2, X-Men United. It also gets us fully into our May anniversaries because this is going to be on May 2nd. Well, we have a lot of anniversaries still coming up. There's some big superhero ones.
I haven't looked in a while.
Well, it's interesting because Iron Man is 15, I think, May 8th. And
I am so in need of a rewatch that too.
So like I was like, there's so many. I think we have a little bit of a break, but there's like so many ones in May too. I honestly can't wait till we get to like Jurassic Park. I think that's June. That's gonna be a fun one to do because I actually haven't watched the first one since before I saw Jurassic World. Came out in 2015, so it's been like
that's gonna be awesome.
Few years, yeah. But yeah, we're plowing through these anniversaries. We're very happy to do them. They're fun. I'm actually happy when they can be like a first time watch for you. I also don't want
Mhm.
to make you feel like I'm making you watch, like, oh, I love this movie. Like, will you watch it for our show?
Hey,
It's
by the
good.
way, I'm happy to do that anytime you want to cover a movie, but no, it
Yeah,
is nice to have like a justification, like a reason to talk about it, though. I totally see what you're saying.
yeah,
But yeah, it's you're never gonna force me to watch anything, you know what I mean? I'm on board, but see what you're saying. It is nice. I love doing the anniversaries as well. And
yeah.
quite fittingly, I think of our episode was just around the length of the
Oh,
movie
the movie?
itself. So
Oh, there we
goes
go.
to show how much there really is in there to chat about and to
Yep.
highlight. But oh, today was fun. I had a good time talking X2.
I did too. Episode 92,
Yeah.
X2, X-Men United Anniversary. We're getting
That
closer and closer to episode 100.
yes,
Uh,
we'll be there.
Before we know it, we'll be there, and it's crazy. It still feels like you've been here the whole time, so I don't feel weird being like, "Oh, we're doing 100 episodes." You've been here for a good chunk of them. Uh, you know
I'd
what?
be curious to
I
count now.
wonder. I'm gonna count it for the show because I'm gonna get Owen's count. I wonder at this point because Owen left at one point if your episode totals are like close to
Close?
each
See,
other.
I would have no idea.
So I'm gonna go back before the 100th episode and see because I'm not gonna count the spin-off stuff. That's separate, but
Right.
it'll be interesting to see like how many because I've been here for all 100 of them. Uh,
Right.
so I'll be interesting to count like that point how many you've done and how many he's done.
Yeah.
Uh,
Interesting to find out
kind
for
of
sure.
see. Yeah, we're really excited. It won't be like a normal episode. It won't be like an anniversary or anything like that. It's just going to be completely dedicated to uh, the
The
podcast
milestone and the
itself. That
podcast.
yeah,
Yeah.
itself. Yeah, that's like the gist of what we're trying to do, and then we have some other stuff that we're thinking of doing as well.
Exactly.
You guys excited for it, but yeah,
And
we're
man,
so
yeah,
close.
I'm quite excited for that to roll up. But with that, that pretty much concludes episode 92, guys. So thanks for sticking with us and for listening to X2. And if you guys had any inkling of wanting to watch this movie, I think it comes highly recommended from both Gaius and myself. So next time you happen to be browsing, or if you have a copy, go throw in X2 X-Men United. It was a fantastic watch. Gaius, it's always pleasure chatting movies with you. As you already know the drill, you know where to find us, wherever you guys get your podcasts, any social media. We are back to the blockbuster. And thanks again for tuning in to episode 92, guys. Talk to you
Peace.
later.